I interrogated an alien captured in Area 53. What he said about God's origin broke me. True story. Look, I need to get this out before I lose my nerve. My name is Marcus Holloway, Staff Sergeant, United States Army. 12 years of service. I've interrogated insurgents in Fallujah, extracted intel from high-value targets in Kandahar, and I've seen things that would make most people need therapy for life. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened 3 months ago. And if this recording disappears, if I disappear, at least someone will know I tried to tell the truth. It started with a phone call at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. I remember the exact time because I was staring at my alarm clock, wondering if I'd imagined the buzzing. It wasn't my regular cell. It was the encrypted Nokia they issued me for field operations, the one that only rings when shit is about to get real. I hadn't heard that thing make a sound in 8 months, not since my last deployment ended. My hand was shaking when I picked it up. No caller ID, just a priority code I'd only seen twice in my entire career. The voice on the other end was clipped. Military. No introduction. Staff Sergeant Holloway, you are to report to coordinates being sent to your secure device. You have 90 minutes. Pack for 72 hours. Tell no one, including family. This is a direct order under National Security Protocol 7. Then the line went dead. Just like that. No explanation, no context, nothing. Protocol 7 isn't something you question. It's above top secret. It's the kind of clearance that technically doesn't exist on paper. I sat there in the dark for maybe 30 seconds, trying to process what just happened. My wife, Rachel, was asleep next to me, and I looked at her face in the dim light from the street lamp outside. Should I wake her? Tell her something? But the orders were clear. Tell no one. In 12 years, I'd never violated a direct order. I wasn't about to start now, even though every instinct in my body was screaming that something was wrong. This wasn't normal protocol. This wasn't even abnormal protocol. This was something else entirely. I got dressed in the dark, grabbed my go bag from the closet, the one I always kept packed out of habit. Standard stuff. 3 days of clothes, basic toiletries, my field notebook. I checked my Glock, loaded a fresh magazine, and tucked it into my waistband. The coordinates came through on my phone while I was lacing my boots. Middle of nowhere, Nevada. Not near any base I recognized. Not near anything, actually. Just a set of numbers that pointed to empty desert about 200 miles northwest of Las Vegas. The drive out there was the longest 3.5 hours of my life. I left Nellis Air Force Base at 3:20 a.m., headed north on the 95, and watched the city lights fade in my rearview mirror. The desert at night is different, man. It's not peaceful like people think. It's oppressive, empty, the kind of empty that makes you feel like you're the last person on Earth. I kept the radio off because I needed to think. Needed to figure out what the hell I was being pulled into. My mind was running through scenarios. Black site inspection? New interrogation technique training? Some kind of readiness test? But none of it made sense. You don't get yanked out of bed at 3 a.m. with 90 minutes notice for training. You don't invoke Protocol 7 for inspections. And you definitely don't send someone 200 miles into the desert to coordinates that don't appear on any map, military or civilian. I pulled up the location on 3 different GPS systems. All of them showed the same thing. Nothing. Just empty federal land with no structures, no roads, no infrastructure. Officially, there was nothing where I was going. About 2 hours into the drive, the sun started coming up behind me. That's when I noticed I wasn't alone on the road anymore. A black Suburban had been maintaining the same distance behind me for the last 40 miles. Not gaining, not falling back. Just there. I tested it. Sped up to 85. It matched. Slowed down to 50. It matched. These weren't highway patrol. This was an escort, though they never acknowledged me, never pulled alongside. They were just making sure I got where I was going. The turnoff came exactly where the coordinates said it would, but you'd miss it if you weren't looking. No signs, no markers, just a gap in the fence line and a dirt road that disappeared into a valley between 2 ridges. The Suburban flashed its lights once, then stopped. I was supposed to go alone from here. I took a breath, gripped the steering wheel, and turned onto that road. The dust cloud behind my truck was the only thing that proved I'd been on the highway at all. That's when I saw it. About 3 miles down that dirt road, tucked into the base of a rock formation that would hide it from aerial surveillance, there was a facility. Not a building exactly, more like the entrance to something underground. Concrete blast doors built into the mountainside, the kind designed to survive a nuclear strike. There were no vehicles outside, no personnel visible, just those doors and a camera system that was definitely tracking my approach. Above the entrance, barely visible in the early morning light, there was a designation stenciled in faded paint, S53. Not Area 53, just S53. And that's when I knew for certain that everything I thought I knew about classified operations was about to get rewritten. The blast doors opened before I even got out of my truck. No intercom, no checkpoint, no guard shack. They just knew I was coming. That should have been my first clue that this place operated on a different level than anything I'd experienced. I've been to black sites in 3 different countries. I've walked into facilities that officially don't exist. But this was something else. The doors were easily 4 feet thick, and as they slid open, I could see they were layered. Steel, concrete, lead, then more steel. Whatever was inside, they'd built this place to keep it contained. I parked where the tire marks on the ground suggested I should, and the moment I killed the engine, those doors started closing behind me. Fast. I had maybe 10 seconds to grab my bag and get clear before they sealed shut with this deep, resonating boom that I felt in my chest. I was in a vehicle bay, but it was weird. Too clean. Most military facilities have oil stains, equipment lying around, some personality. This was sterile. The lighting was this harsh LED white that made everything look like a hospital operating room. And it was cold. Not air conditioning cold. Cold like a morgue. There were cameras everywhere. I counted 12 in just the vehicle bay alone, and these weren't your standard security cameras. These were the kind that track movement, that record in infrared and probably a dozen other spectrums I couldn't see. I felt them following me as I walked toward the only door, which was also sealed. Next to it was a biometric scanner. I stood there for a second, confused, until the panel just activated on its own. A green light, a click, and the door opened. They'd already programmed my biometrics into the system. They'd been expecting me specifically. The corridor beyond was long and sloped downward. We were going underground, deep underground. I could feel it in my ears, that pressure change you get when you're descending. The walls were bare concrete, reinforced with steel beams every 20 feet. Every 100 feet or so there was another blast door, each one opening as I approached and sealing behind me. I counted 5 of them before I reached what looked like a checkpoint. And that's where I met Dr. Sarah Chen. She was waiting for me in what I guess you'd call a security station, though it looked more like mission control at NASA. Screens everywhere, displaying camera feeds, biometric data, system readouts I couldn't begin to interpret. She was maybe 40, Asian American, wearing a white lab coat over what looked like military fatigues, but no rank insignia, no name tape, nothing identifying. When I walked in, she was staring at one of the monitors, and she didn't turn around right away. When she finally did, the first thing I noticed was that she wouldn't look me in the eye. "Staff Sergeant Holloway," she said. Not a question, just confirmation. Her voice was flat, controlled, like she was actively suppressing emotion. "I'm Dr. Chen. I'll be your handler for the duration of your assignment here." She slid a tablet across the desk toward me without meeting my gaze. "Before we proceed, you need to sign these documents. Read them carefully. Once you sign, there's no going back." I picked up the tablet and started scrolling. It was an NDA, but not like any I'd seen before. This wasn't about protecting classified information. This was about protecting them from me. The language was specific and terrifying. If I disclosed anything about this facility, its location, its purpose, or anything I witnessed here, I would be subject to immediate detention under the National Defense Authorization Act. No trial, no lawyer, just disappearance. But it went further than that. My family could be detained for security purposes if I was deemed a risk. My financial assets could be seized. My military record could be erased. It was essentially a contract that said, "We own you now, and if you talk, we own everyone you love too." I've signed NDAs before. This was a threat. "What exactly am I being read into here?" I asked, looking up at Chen. She was still avoiding eye contact, staring at one of the monitors instead. "That's explained in the briefing. After you sign." Her tone made it clear there was no negotiation here. Sign or leave. Except I had a feeling that leaving wasn't really an option anymore. Those blast doors behind me hadn't opened since I'd arrived. I was already in. The signature was just a formality, so I signed. What else was I going to do? The moment my finger left the screen, something changed in the room. A lock clicked somewhere. Chen finally looked at me, and what I saw in her eyes wasn't relief or welcome. It was pity. "Follow me," she said, standing up. We went deeper, More corridors, more blast doors, more descending. I tried to keep track of how far down we'd gone, but I lost count after what felt like 10 stories. The air got colder. There was a smell too, something I couldn't quite place. Clinical, but with an underlying wrongness to it, like disinfectant trying to cover up something organic and decaying. Chen walked fast, like she wanted to get this over with. We passed a few other personnel, all wearing the same unmarked fatigues, and none of them made eye contact with me either. It was like I'd already become a ghost. We stopped at a door marked Briefing Room 3. Chen swiped her badge, pressed her palm to another scanner, and leaned in for a retinal scan. 3 layers of security for a briefing room. Inside, it was small. Just a table, 2 chairs, and a screen built into the wall. No windows, obviously. We were probably 300 feet underground at this point. Chen gestured for me to sit, and she took the chair across from me. For the first time since I'd arrived, she really looked at me. Her expression was carefully neutral, but I could see the strain around her eyes. Staff Sergeant Holloway, what I'm about to tell you will fundamentally alter your understanding of reality, she began, and her voice had this rehearsed quality, like she'd given this speech before. You've been selected for this assignment because of your psychological profile, your interrogation experience, and your security clearance. What you're about to see is classified above top secret. It's classified above anything you've ever been briefed on. In fact, the classification level we operate under here doesn't have an official designation. We simply call it Apex. She paused, watching me. Before I continue, I need you to understand something. This is not a drill. This is not a test. This is not a psychological evaluation. What we have here in Site 53 is real. And after today, you'll never be the same person you were when you walked through those doors. That's when I felt it. That cold certainty in your gut. When you realize you've crossed a line you can't uncross. This wasn't about interrogation techniques or new protocols. This was something else entirely. Something that required 10 blast doors and NDAs that threatened your entire family. Something that made a clearly experienced scientist unable to look you in the eye until absolutely necessary. I thought about Rachel, probably waking up right now and finding me gone. No note, no explanation. I thought about my life before this morning. How normal and predictable it had been. And I knew, sitting in that briefing room 300 feet below the Nevada desert, that nothing would ever be normal again. Chen reached for a remote on the table, and the screen on the wall flickered to life. No preamble, no warm-up, just straight into it. The first image was a satellite feed, date-stamped 3 weeks prior, showing the Nevada desert from above. There was a timestamp running in the corner, and I watched as it ticked forward in real time. At 03:47:22, something entered the frame from the upper right. It was moving fast, too fast to be a plane, and it was trailing something. Not smoke exactly, more like a distortion in the air itself, like heat shimmer, but wrong. The object was losing altitude rapidly, and even from satellite perspective, I could tell this wasn't a controlled descent. This was a crash. It impacted in a dried lake bed about 40 miles from where we were sitting, and the dust cloud that kicked up was massive. Chen paused the feed. This is what we call Event Sentinel-9, she said, her voice clinical and detached, like she was describing a weather pattern instead of what I was seeing. The object was first detected by NORAD at 03:44:17, entering atmosphere over the Pacific. It crossed into U.S. airspace at 03:46:05. Impact occurred at 03:47:24. She clicked to the next image, and my stomach dropped. This was ground-level footage, clearly taken by someone who'd gotten to the crash site fast. Too fast. They'd been ready for this. The crater was maybe 30 feet across, still smoking, but what got me was the object itself. It wasn't debris. It was intact, or mostly intact. Oblong, maybe 15 feet long, made of something that looked like metal but moved like liquid in the camera's thermal imaging. The surface seemed to shift and ripple, even though it was clearly solid. There were no seams, no rivets, no windows, no markings. Just this smooth, impossible thing sitting in the middle of the Nevada desert, like it had always been there. Chen advanced through several more images. Recovery teams in hazmat suits approaching. Geiger counters showing radiation levels. Spectral analysis I couldn't interpret. Recovery team was on site within 40 minutes, Chen continued. The object was emitting electromagnetic frequencies across multiple spectrums. Temperature was fluctuating between -40 and +200 degrees Celsius. No apparent power source. No propulsion system we could identify. She paused the slideshow on an image that made my training and experience struggle to categorize what I was seeing. The recovery team had cut into the object somehow, and they were extracting something. Not something. Someone. Something shaped like a person, but wrong in every proportion. My brain kept trying to make it make sense, but it couldn't. "Is this some kind of test?" I asked, and I hated how uncertain my voice sounded. Psychological evaluation? New interrogation scenario training? Chen looked at me then, really looked at me, and there was no humor in her expression. None. "I wish it was, Staff Sergeant. I really do." She clicked to the next image, and this one was clearer. Clinical photography, taken in what looked like a medical bay. The entity was laid out on an examination table, and now I could see it in detail. It was roughly humanoid, maybe 4.5 feet tall, but the proportions were all wrong. The limbs were too long, too thin. The torso was narrow, almost fragile looking. The head was larger than it should be, and the face, Jesus, the face. 2 large eyes, but they weren't like human eyes. They were dark, completely dark. No visible iris or pupil, just black. No nose to speak of, just slight indentations. A mouth that was more of a slit. The skin looked gray in the photos, but it had this texture that seemed almost translucent, like you could see shadows of structures underneath. "What we're designating as a non-terrestrial biological entity," Chen said, and she used that term like it was perfectly normal, like she was describing a new species of beetle instead of something that rewrote everything we understood about life in the universe. NTBE for short. "Recovered alive but severely injured from the crash. Multiple fractures. Internal damage consistent with high-velocity impact. It's been in our medical containment unit for 20 days. She pulled up what looked like a medical chart, full of data I couldn't begin to interpret. "Physiology is unlike anything we've encountered. Carbon-based, but the cellular structure is completely foreign. DNA, if you can call it that, has a completely different architecture. 6 base pairs instead of 4. Protein synthesis operates on principles our biochemists are still trying to understand." She was rattling off this information like she was reading a grocery list, but I could see her hands shaking slightly as she worked the remote. I leaned back in my chair, trying to process what she was telling me. My first instinct was still denial. This had to be some elaborate hoax, CGI, prosthetics, maybe even a genetic experiment gone wrong. "This could be anything," I said, but even as the words came out, they sounded weak. "Advanced prosthetics, foreign technology, some kind of bioengineered asset from China or Russia. You're telling me this is extraterrestrial, and I'm supposed to just accept that?" Chen nodded slowly, like she'd expected this response. "We ran every test imaginable, Staff Sergeant. Metallurgic analysis of the craft shows isotope ratios that don't exist naturally on Earth. The entity's cellular structure contains elements in combinations that would require environmental conditions we've never encountered. Its neural architecture is more complex than human by an order of magnitude. This isn't Russian. This isn't Chinese. This isn't from here." She clicked to another image, and this one showed the entity awake. Sort of. It was in what looked like a containment cell, sitting upright on a bench that was bolted to the floor. Those black eyes were open, and even through the photograph, they seemed to be looking directly at the camera, directly at me. There was an intelligence there that was unmistakable and deeply unsettling. "It's been conscious for 18 days, Chen said. "Hasn't eaten anything we've offered, hasn't drunk water, hasn't attempted to communicate, hasn't responded to any stimuli, just sits there, watching. Our medical team can't figure out how it's surviving without nutrition or hydration. Whatever it is, it doesn't follow our biological rules." She turned off the screen and looked at me directly. "That's where you come in, Staff Sergeant. We need it to talk. We need to know what it's doing here, where it came from, what its intentions are, what capabilities it or others like it might have. You've broken hardened insurgents. You've gotten information from people trained to resist interrogation. Now we need you to get information from that." The weight of what she was asking hit me then. They wanted me to interrogate something that wasn't human, something that might not even think the way we think, communicate the way we communicate, or respond to any technique I'd ever learned. "You understand this is completely outside my training," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I interrogate people, human beings with human psychology, human needs, human fears. This thing, I don't even know where to start." "What makes you think it'll respond to anything I do?" Chen's expression softened slightly, and for the first time, she looked almost sympathetic. "Honestly, we don't know if it will. We've had linguists try to establish communication, We've had xenobiologists. Yes, we have those now. Attempt to understand its behavioral patterns. We've had our best people in there for 3 weeks, and we've gotten nothing. But you have something they don't. You have an instinct for breaking through walls. You can read people, find their pressure points, understand what motivates them. We're hoping that skill translates, even across species. And if it doesn't, I asked, if I go in there and get nothing, just like everyone else? Chen stood up, gathering the tablet and remote. Then we moved to more aggressive measures. Measures I really hope we don't have to employ. The way she said it made my skin crawl. I didn't want to know what aggressive measures meant in this context. You'll have 48 hours of observation before your first session, she continued. We'll show you everything we've learned about its behavior, its patterns, its responses to various stimuli. You'll be briefed on safety protocols. The containment cell is designed to withstand significant force, and there are fail-safes in place. But Staff Sergeant, I need you to understand something. She paused at the door, finally showing some real emotion. Fear. This entity has shown no aggression toward us. None. It's been completely passive since recovery, but we don't know why. We don't know if it's injured, strategic, or something else entirely. When you go in that room, you'll be in an enclosed space with something we don't understand. Something that came from somewhere we can't even imagine. Are you prepared for that? Was I prepared? How the hell do you prepare for something like this? I'd been in rooms with terrorists who'd killed children. I'd sat across from men who'd beheaded journalists and felt no remorse. I'd looked into the eyes of people who wanted nothing more than to see me dead. But this was different. This wasn't human evil or human psychology. This was unknown on a level that made everything I'd experienced seem quaint by comparison. I need to see it, I said, standing up. Not through photos or video. I need to see it with my own eyes before I commit to this. Chen nodded like she'd expected this too. Follow me. But Staff Sergeant, before we go down there, I need to tell you something. Everyone who's seen the entity in person, who's spent time in its presence, reports the same thing. A feeling, like it's looking inside you. Not at you, inside you. Some of our people have requested transfers after just one observation session. So I'm giving you fair warning. Once you see it, once you're in that room, you can't unsee it. You can't unknow it. This is your last chance to walk away. But I'd already signed the papers, already descended into this place, already crossed the line between the world I knew and this new reality. Walking away wasn't an option. Not really. Maybe it never had been. Show me, I said, and Chen opened the door. We walked in silence through more corridors, descending even deeper into the facility. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees. That smell got stronger, that wrong smell that I still couldn't place. We passed through 2 more security checkpoints, each one requiring more biometric verification than the last. Finally, we stopped in front of a heavy door marked with symbols I didn't recognize and words I did. Containment Level Alpha, authorized personnel only. Lethal force authorized. Chen placed her hand on the door. Last chance, she said quietly. I thought about Rachel. I thought about my normal life that had ended exactly 4 hours ago. I thought about every choice that had led me to this moment, standing in front of a door that would change everything. Open it, I said, and she did. The observation room was small, maybe 10 by 12 feet, and dark except for the light bleeding through from the cell beyond the 2-way mirror. Chen gestured for me to approach the glass, but she hung back near the door like she didn't want to get too close. I stepped up to the mirror, and for a moment, all I could see was the cell itself. It was maybe 20 feet square, walls made of that same reinforced concrete I'd been seeing throughout the facility, but smoother somehow, almost polished. The lighting was soft, diffused, coming from panels in the ceiling that gave off this weird bluish-white glow. There was a bench bolted to the far wall, a toilet in the corner with no privacy screen, and a drain in the center of the floor. That was it. No decorations, no windows, no comfort, just a box designed to hold something. And then I saw it move, just a slight shift in the shadows on the bench, and suddenly my brain registered that what I'd thought was just a dark spot on the wall was actually the entity. It was sitting there, perfectly still, and it had been so motionless that my eyes had literally skipped over it at first, categorizing it as part of the environment instead of a living thing. That should have been impossible. Nothing living stays that still. But there it was. My first instinct when I finally focused on it was denial. My brain just refused to accept what my eyes were seeing. It looked like someone had tried to sculpt a human being from memory, but got all the proportions wrong, stretched everything in the wrong directions, made it too thin, too angular, too alien. It was sitting with its back against the wall, legs drawn up slightly, arms resting on its knees, and the posture was almost human, almost familiar, but wrong enough to trigger every evolutionary alarm system in my nervous system. This wasn't camouflage or costume. This wasn't prosthetics or CGI. This was real, and my body knew it before my conscious mind could catch up. I felt my heart rate spike, felt sweat break out on my palms, felt that primitive fight or flight response kicking in even though I was safely behind reinforced glass. Jesus Christ, I whispered, and I didn't even realize I'd spoken out loud until Chen responded behind me. That's a common first reaction, she said quietly. It gets worse the longer you look. She was right. The more I stared, the more details resolved, and each one made it harder to rationalize what I was seeing. The skin was gray, but not like gray paint or gray fabric. It had depth to it, almost like looking at fog or smoke that had somehow solidified. In the bluish light of the cell, I could see what looked like darker patterns beneath the surface, like veins or neural pathways, but they moved in ways that didn't match any anatomy I'd ever studied. The head was too large for the body, bulbous at the top, narrowing to a chin that was too pointed, too delicate. Those eyes were the worst. Even from this distance, even through the mirror, they dominated its face. Completely black, no visible pupils or iris, just solid darkness that seemed to absorb light instead of reflect it. They were almond-shaped, wrapped around the sides of the head slightly, giving it a field of vision that had to be close to 270 degrees. No eyelids that I could see, no blinking, just open, staring, seeing. The nose was barely there, just two small slits where a nose should be, rising and falling slightly. It was breathing. That detail hit me hard. It was breathing. This thing from somewhere else, something that shouldn't exist according to everything I'd been taught about life and the universe, was sitting in a cell in Nevada and breathing our air. The injuries Chen had mentioned were visible, now that I knew what to look for. There was a darkening along the left side of its ribcage, like bruising, though the color was wrong, more of a deep purple-black than the yellow-green of human contusions. Its left arm hung at a slightly odd angle, and I could see what looked like a compression bandage around the forearm, though the material was unlike any medical dressing I'd seen. Someone had tried to treat it, tried to heal it, and that raised so many questions I couldn't even begin to process them. How do you perform medicine on something you don't understand? How do you know what helps versus what hurts? One of its legs had some kind of external fixation device attached, metal pins going into the flesh at angles that made my own leg ache in sympathy. It had been in a crash violent enough to break bones, and it had survived. More than survived. It was conscious, aware, watching. How long has it been sitting like that? I asked, unable to take my eyes off it. Chen checked her tablet. In that exact position, 4 hours and 17 minutes. Before that, it was standing in the corner for 6 hours. Before that, sitting but facing the other direction for 8 hours. It shifts position every few hours, but when it's still, it's completely still. No fidgeting, no adjustment, no scratching or shifting weight, just absolute stillness. That wasn't natural. Even trained soldiers couldn't maintain perfect stillness for that long. Your body betrays you. You blink, you swallow, you shift your weight, you breathe deeper, something. But this thing just existed in stasis, like someone had paused a video. Has it slept? I asked. We don't think so, Chen replied. We've been monitoring for 20 days, 24 hours a day. It closes its eyes sometimes, if you can call it that. The eyes just sort of dim. The blackness becomes deeper somehow. It does that for maybe 30 minutes every 12 hours or so, but its vital signs don't change. No REM patterns, no sleep cycles. It might not need sleep the way we do. I forced myself to look away from the entity and examine the rest of the cell more carefully. There were cameras in all 4 upper corners, barely visible but definitely there. The walls had seams every few feet, and I realized those were probably panels that could open, maybe for delivering food or removing the entity if needed. The floor had a slight slope toward that central drain, for cleaning, for removing waste. The thought made me uncomfortable. There was a tray near the bench, pushed to the side with what looked like untouched food, some kind of fruit maybe, a container of water with a straw, both completely ignored. You said it hasn't eaten, I said. Not once in 20 days. We've tried everything. Human food, raw meat, vegetables, fruits, grains, liquids. We even tried synthesizing a nutrient solution based on what we know of its biochemistry. It doesn't touch anything, doesn't even look at it. We have no idea how it's surviving. Chen moved up beside me at the glass, and I noticed she was careful not to look directly at the entity. She kept her eyes on the tablet. The working theory is that it has some way of extracting energy directly from its environment. Maybe photosynthesis, though that doesn't quite fit. Maybe it processes atmospheric elements we haven't detected. Or maybe it's just dying slowly, and we're watching it starve in ways we don't understand. That's when the smell hit me. I'd noticed it earlier, that wrong smell that permeated the facility. But here in the observation room, it was stronger. It was coming from the cell, I realized. Coming from the entity itself. It wasn't unpleasant exactly, but it wasn't right. The closest comparison I could make was ozone, that sharp electric smell you get after lightning, mixed with something organic but not decaying, more like soil after rain, but with a metallic undertone that made my sinuses itch. You smell that? I asked Chen. She nodded. Everyone does. It's stronger when you're in the cell with it. One of our researchers described it as smelling purple, which doesn't make sense, but somehow everyone knew what he meant. It's the smell of wrongness. Your brain can't categorize it, so it just triggers this low-level anxiety response. She wasn't kidding. I could feel it in my gut, that unease that comes from encountering something that doesn't fit into your understanding of reality. I watched the entity for another 10 minutes, trying to apply my training, trying to categorize and assess the way I would with any other subject. Military mind trying to make sense of the senseless. Look for tells, look for weaknesses, look for patterns. But there was nothing. It just sat there, that too large head, tilted at an angle that would be uncomfortable for a human. Those black eyes staring at the wall across from it, not looking around, not searching for escape routes or weaknesses in the cell, just staring. What's it looking at? I asked. Chen shrugged. That wall. Sometimes it looks at the ceiling, sometimes the floor. Sometimes it faces the mirror and stares right where we're standing. The first time it did that, the observer on duty panicked. Thought somehow it could see through the glass, but it's impossible. The mirror is one way, and we've tested it thoroughly. It can't see us, but I wasn't so sure. There was something about the way it held itself, the way it oriented its body. It wasn't the posture of something confined. It was the posture of something waiting. Has it shown any aggression at all? I asked, my interrogator instincts trying to build a psychological profile from whatever data I could gather. Tested the walls? Tried the door? Anything that suggests it wants out? Chen shook her head. Nothing. When we first brought it in, when it was still severely injured, it actually helped. Held out its arm for IVs, stayed still for examinations, allowed the medical team to set its broken bones. It was compliant to the point of being unsettling. Like it understood what we were trying to do and was cooperating, but it never tried to communicate, never made a sound. The only vocalizations we've recorded are breathing sounds. That was wrong too. In my experience, captives fell into patterns. They resisted, or they cooperated, but with obvious calculation. They bargained, they threatened, they pleaded, they withdrew. They did something that indicated a psychology you could work with. This thing was doing none of that. It was simply existing in the space, neither resisting nor cooperating, just being. I stepped closer to the glass, close enough that my breath fogged it slightly. The entity's head moved, not quickly, not startled, just a slow, fluid rotation until those black eyes were pointed directly at the mirror, directly at me. My rational brain said it couldn't see me, that the mirror was one way, that this was just coincidence. But every instinct I had screamed otherwise. It knew I was there. It knew I was watching, and it was watching back. We stayed like that for maybe 30 seconds. Me and this thing from somewhere I couldn't imagine, separated by reinforced glass and the entire gulf of evolutionary history. I'd stared down killers before. I'd locked eyes with men who'd done terrible things and felt no remorse. But this was different. This wasn't human malice or human calculation. This was something else entirely. Something that made me feel like I was the one being interrogated, being assessed, being measured and found. What? Wanting? Interesting? Irrelevant? I couldn't tell. I need to know everything, I said finally, breaking eye contact and stepping back from the glass. My hands were shaking slightly, and I shoved them in my pockets so Chen wouldn't see. Every observation, every test result, every theory your people have developed, If I'm going in there, if I'm going to sit across from that thing and try to make it communicate, I need every possible advantage. Chen nodded, relief evident on her face. "You're actually going to do it?" she asked. I looked back at the entity. It had returned to its original position, staring at the far wall again, perfectly still. Like our moment of connection, if that's what it was, had never happened. "Yeah," I said, though my mouth was dry and my heart was still racing. "Yeah, I'm going to do it, because if I don't, someone else will, and they might not be as careful. They might not try to understand it first." What I didn't say was that I was terrified, not of physical danger. The entity showed no signs of aggression. I was terrified of what it represented. Proof that we weren't alone. Proof that everything we thought we knew about life and intelligence and our place in the universe was wrong. And I was terrified that if I went into that cell, if I looked into those black eyes from across a table instead of through protective glass, I might learn something I couldn't unlearn, something that would change me in ways I couldn't predict. But I was going to do it anyway, because that's what I'd been trained for, because someone had to, and because, God help me, I wanted to know. I needed to know. What the hell was sitting in that cell, and they gave me 48 hours, and I spent every waking minute at studying. Chen provided me with hundreds of hours of surveillance, medical reports written in terminology I barely, behavioral analysis nobody knew what they was thinking at all. I watched it sit motionless for 6 hours straight. I watched it stand and examine the walls with its long, thin fingers, touching the concrete with a gentleness that seemed almost reverent. I watched it in what passed for sleep, that strange dimming of its eyes while its body remained upright and alert. I studied every frame, looking for patterns, for tells, for anything that would give me an edge when I finally sat across from it. But the more I watched, the more I realized I was going into that cell essentially blind. On the morning of my first session, I barely slept, kept thinking about Rachel, wondering what she thought had happened to me. My phone had been confiscated the day I arrived. No contact with the outside world. For all she knew, I was dead, and maybe that would have been easier for her than the truth. The security protocols for entering the containment cell were extensive and frankly terrifying. First, I had to undergo a full medical screening, blood pressure, heart rate, neural activity monitoring. They fitted me with a device that looked like a watch, but was actually a biometric tracker that would alert the control room if my vitals spiked above certain thresholds. "If you show signs of extreme stress, we pull you out immediately," Chen explained as the medical tech strapped it to my wrist. "We've had 3 personnel suffer what we're calling proximity events, when in close contact with the entity. Panic attacks, dissociative episodes, 1 case of temporary aphasia. We don't know if the entity is causing these reactions, or if it's just psychological response to being near it, but we're not taking chances." That was comforting. Then came the weapons check. I had to strip down completely, put on facility-issued clothing that had no zippers, no buttons, nothing that could be used as a weapon or tool. They even checked my mouth for false teeth or hidden objects. "The entity has shown no aggression," Chen reminded me, "but we don't know its capabilities. No projectiles, no sharps, nothing that could be used to harm you or it." I was going in there essentially naked, armed with nothing but my voice and whatever psychological training I could apply to something that might not even have psychology as we understood it. The cell entry procedure was something out of a science fiction movie. First, you entered through a decontamination chamber where you were sprayed with something that smelled like industrial disinfectant mixed with ozone. Then through an airlock where the pressure equalized with a pop in my ears that made my eyes water. Then a final door that was 4 inches of solid steel with biometric locks that required Chen's authorization, my handprint, and a retinal scan. The door opened with a hiss of hydraulics, and that smell hit me like a physical force. That wrong smell, that purple smell, that scent of otherness. It was so much stronger in here than it had been in the observation room. My sinuses burned, my eyes watered. And underneath it all was that metallic taste on the back of my tongue, like I'd been chewing on batteries. The entity was sitting on the bench exactly where I'd last seen it on the monitors. It didn't turn when the door opened, didn't acknowledge my presence in any way, just kept staring at that far wall like I was completely irrelevant to its existence. I stepped into the cell, heard the door seal behind me with a finality that made my chest tight, and I was alone with it. Alone with something that had come from somewhere I couldn't imagine. Sitting in a concrete box 300 feet below the Nevada desert. I took the chair they'd bolted to the floor across from the bench. It was maybe 8 feet of distance between us, close enough to establish presence, but far enough to avoid violating what I hoped was its personal space, assuming it had concepts like personal space. The entity still hadn't acknowledged me. I sat there for a full minute, just breathing, trying to control my heart rate, trying to project calm authority the way I'd been trained. Start with silence. Let them get used to your presence. Let them wonder what you're thinking. Make them curious. That was Interrogation 101. But I was already realizing that nothing I'd learned in interrogation school, nothing I'd practiced in the field, was going to apply here. This wasn't a human being with human needs and human fears. This was something else entirely, and I was making assumptions based on my own psychology, not its. "My name is Marcus Holloway," I said finally, breaking the silence. My voice sounded too loud in the small space, echoing slightly off the concrete walls. "I'm a staff sergeant in the United States Army. I've been asked to speak with you." Nothing. No reaction. The entity kept staring at the wall. I couldn't even tell if it was breathing. "I know you've been through a traumatic experience," I continued, using the rapport-building approach. Acknowledge their suffering, show empathy, establish common ground. The crash must have been terrifying. You're injured. You're in an unfamiliar place, surrounded by beings you don't know. I want you to understand that we're not trying to hurt you. We're trying to help, but we need your cooperation. Still nothing. I watched for any sign of response. A twitch, a shift in breathing, a flicker in those black eyes. But it was like talking to a statue. I tried a different approach. Authority and expectation. "You need to understand your situation," I said, letting some hardness creep into my voice. "You're in a classified military facility. You're being held under national security protocols. The people in charge of this facility, they have questions, important questions. Where you're from, what you're doing here, what your intentions are, whether there are others like you. If you cooperate, if you communicate with us, this can be a lot easier for you. We can work together to find a solution." Nothing, not even a blink. I could feel sweat starting to soak through my shirt, despite the cool temperature of the cell. This was wrong. Even the most hardened subjects showed some response, even if it was just a facial micro-expression, a tension in the shoulders, something that indicated they heard you and were processing. This thing was giving me nothing. It was like interrogating furniture. I tried offering incentives. "Is there anything you need? Better medical care? Different accommodations? We can make you more comfortable if you work with us. We can help you heal from your injuries. We can provide whatever you require." Still nothing. I tried appealing to logic. "There has to be a reason you came here, a purpose, a mission. Help us understand it. Help us help you accomplish whatever you came here to do." Nothing. I tried every approach in my toolkit. I cajoled, I threatened, I bargained, I sympathized. I told it stories about my own life, trying to establish human connection even though I knew that was absurd. I sat in silence for long stretches, seeing if it would break first. I asked direct questions. I asked open-ended questions. I asked questions that should have provoked some kind of response, even if it was just confusion or irritation. And through it all, for hour after hour, the entity just sat there, staring at the wall, breathing so shallowly I could barely detect it, existing in that space but completely disconnected from me, from the conversation, from everything. After 3 hours, my voice was getting hoarse. My back ached from sitting in the metal chair. My mind was exhausted from the effort of trying to establish any kind of connection with something that seemed to exist in a completely different reality than I did. I was starting to understand why the other interrogators had failed. This wasn't about breaking through resistance. This wasn't about overcoming training or cultural barriers. This was about trying to communicate across a gulf so vast that maybe communication was impossible. Maybe we were just too different. Maybe whatever it thought, whatever it experienced, whatever motivated it, was so alien that there was no common ground at all. The thought was profoundly depressing. I'd come here thinking I could do what others couldn't, that my skills would somehow bridge the gap. But I was just another human throwing words at something that might not even comprehend the concept of language as we understood it. I stood up, feeling defeat settle into my bones. "I'm going to go now," I said, not even sure why I was bothering to explain myself to something that clearly didn't care whether I stayed or left. "I'll come back tomorrow. We'll try again." I walked to the door, raised my hand to signal the control room to open it, and that's when I felt it. Not heard it, felt it. A pressure in my head, behind my eyes, like the buildup before a migraine, but different, more focused, more intentional. I froze. The door was still sealed. I was still trapped in here with it, and something had just changed in the room. The air felt heavier. That wrong smell intensified, and very slowly I turned around. The entity had moved. For the first time since I'd entered the cell, it had broken its perfect stillness. Its head was tilted at an angle, maybe 30 degrees off vertical, and those black eyes were pointed directly at me, not at the space I occupied. At me, into me, through me. Then I heard it. Except heard isn't the right word. It wasn't sound. There were no vibrations in the air, no acoustic waves hitting my eardrums. It was directly in my mind, bypassing every normal sensory channel, and appearing fully formed in my consciousness like it had always been there. A voice that wasn't a voice, words that weren't spoken. "Why do you speak to the gardener who left?" That's what it said, or didn't say, or thought at me, or whatever the hell it was doing. The words were clear, perfectly formed English, but they carried with them concepts and images and feelings that English couldn't capture. I saw flashes of something vast and incomprehensible, beings made of light or energy or something my brain couldn't process. Worlds spinning in the darkness, and underneath it all, a question that wasn't just about words, but about meaning, about purpose, about the fundamental nature of existence. "What?" I managed to say out loud, though my mouth was dry and my tongue felt thick. My heart was hammering in my chest. The biometric tracker on my wrist was probably screaming alerts to the control room, but the door stayed sealed. They were letting this play out, or maybe they couldn't hear what I was hearing. Maybe this was just between me and it. The entity's head tilted the other direction, a movement that was almost curious, almost bird-like, but wrong because nothing about its anatomy suggested it should move that way. "Your prayers," the not voice said in my head. "Why do you waste them?" And I felt it then, felt it reaching into my mind not roughly but with an alien precision, pulling up memories I hadn't thought about in years. My mother kneeling beside my father's hospital bed, rosary clutched in her hands, whispering Hail Marys while machines beeped their countdown to death. My buddy Martinez in Fallujah, cross around his neck, praying before every patrol like God was some kind of ballistic armor. The chaplain at my wedding talking about holy union and divine blessing like any of it meant something beyond the words. Every prayer I'd ever heard, every desperate plea to a God I'd stopped believing in years ago, but had never quite shaken. All of it pulled to the surface of my consciousness and examined by something that viewed it with what I can only describe as confusion. Clinical, detached confusion. Like a scientist studying a cargo cult's ritual and trying to understand why they thought airplane-shaped idols would make planes land. "I don't understand the question," I said, and I hated how weak my voice sounded. I was supposed to be the interrogator. I was supposed to be in control, but I was the one being questioned now, being dissected, being examined by an intelligence that operated on principles I couldn't comprehend. The entity didn't move, but I felt it in my head again, more insistent this time. The gardener who tended your world, who seeded your consciousness, who shaped your evolution, he left, long ago. Your prayers go nowhere. Why do you continue? And with those words came images, concepts, understanding that crashed into my mind like ice water. I saw Earth from space, but not as it was now. Earth billions of years ago, barren and lifeless. And I saw something else there, something vast and powerful beyond human comprehension, something that touched the planet with intention and purpose. Gardener, that's what it had called it. Not God, gardener. Like Earth was a garden, and life was something cultivated. And then I saw that presence turn away, lose interest, abandon the project, leave humanity spinning alone in the dark, calling out to something that wasn't listening because it had moved on to other gardens, other experiments, other worlds. "No," I whispered, because I didn't know what else to say. Because what it was showing me, what it was implying, was too big, too terrible, too fundamentally world-shattering. The door behind me opened. I barely heard it. Chen's voice came over the intercom, tinny and distant. "Staff Sergeant, we're seeing critical stress levels. We need to extract you now." But I couldn't move. I was locked in place, staring at those black eyes, feeling that presence in my mind, understanding with horrible clarity that this thing wasn't my prisoner. I was its curiosity, a specimen to be examined, a puzzle to be solved. And the question it was asking, the question that echoed in my skull as security personnel entered the cell and pulled me toward the door, was one I didn't have an answer for, one that would haunt me every day for the rest of my life. Why do you pray to something that isn't listening? Why do you call out to a God who left you behind? They pulled me out of that cell and I couldn't stop shaking. Not from fear exactly, though there was plenty of that. It was more like my entire nervous system had been overloaded. Like I'd grabbed a live wire and couldn't let go. Chen and 2 security personnel practically carried me to a medical bay where they strapped monitors to my chest, shined lights in my eyes, asked me questions I couldn't answer because I didn't have words for what had just happened. "Did it hurt you?" Chen kept asking. And I kept shaking my head because how do you explain that it hadn't touched me physically, but had violated something deeper than flesh? It had been inside my mind. Not reading my thoughts exactly, but communicating in a way that bypassed every normal channel of human interaction. It had spoken directly into my consciousness, and the experience was so profoundly wrong that my brain kept trying to reject it, kept trying to convince me it hadn't happened. But I could still feel the residue of it, like phantom fingers pressed against the inside of my skull. The medical team gave me something to calm down, some kind of sedative that took the edge off but didn't erase what I'd experienced. I sat in that medical bay for 2 hours, wrapped in a blanket, even though I wasn't cold, just needing something to anchor me to physical reality. Chen sat across from me the whole time, tablet in hand, occasionally making notes, but mostly just watching me with that same concerned expression I'd seen when we first met. "When you're ready," she said quietly, "I need you to tell me everything that happened in there, every detail you can remember." And I wanted to. God, I wanted to explain it. But where do you even start? How do you describe communication that doesn't use sound or gesture, or any medium that humans evolved to process? "It spoke to me," I said finally, and my voice sounded distant, even to my own ears. Not out loud, in my head, directly into my thoughts. Chen nodded like she'd expected this. 3 of our linguists reported similar experiences. They described it as invasive, disorienting, like someone was downloading information directly into their consciousness without their permission. That was exactly it. It wasn't like hearing someone speak or reading text. It was like waking up and suddenly knowing something you hadn't known before, except you were conscious for the process, aware of foreign concepts being inserted into your mind. "What did it say?" Chen asked, pen poised over her tablet. I closed my eyes, trying to organize the experience into something linear, something that made sense. It asked me a question about God, about prayer. I opened my eyes and looked at her. It wanted to know why we pray to something it called the gardener who left. It showed me images, concepts, Earth being seeded with life by some kind of advanced being, then that being abandoning us, walking away from the experiment. Chen's pen had stopped moving. She was staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. "The entity communicated theological concepts?" she asked carefully. "Not theology," I said, frustrated because I couldn't make her understand. It wasn't talking about belief or faith. It was stating facts, or what it believes are facts. It showed me Earth billions of years ago, and something touching it, shaping it, starting life here intentionally, then leaving, moving on to other projects while humanity just kept calling out to an empty sky. The implications of that hit me as I said it out loud. If what the entity had shown me was true, if it wasn't just some kind of psychological warfare or manipulation, then every religion on Earth was wrong. Not wrong in the sense that they picked the wrong rules or rituals, wrong in the fundamental premise that there was anyone listening, that there had ever been anyone listening after a certain point. We were an abandoned experiment, and all our prayers were just echoes in an empty room. "Jesus Christ," I muttered, and then laughed bitterly at the irony of using that phrase. Chen was making rapid notes on her tablet now, her fingers flying across the screen. "This is consistent with what the linguists reported," she said. They described receiving information about what the entity called gardeners, beings that seed consciousness across multiple worlds. They thought it was metaphorical, some kind of creation myth from its culture. "You're saying it presented this as literal fact?" I nodded. "It wasn't telling me a story. It was explaining reality, like if you asked me why the sky is blue and I explained the physics of light refraction. That's the tone of it. Clinical, factual, not open for interpretation." Chen set down her tablet and rubbed her eyes. She looked exhausted, and I realized this was probably destroying her worldview too. Everyone who came in contact with this thing, everyone who heard what it had to say, we were all having to reckon with implications that were too big to process. "Staff Sergeant, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly," she said. "Do you believe what it showed you? Do you think it's telling the truth? I sat with that question for a long moment. Did I believe it? My rational mind said no. This was clearly some kind of manipulation, some psychological tactic to destabilize us. But my gut, my instinct, the part of me that had learned to read truth and lies across 1,000 interrogations, that part was screaming, yes. The entity wasn't lying. It didn't have a reason to lie. It was simply explaining reality from its perspective. And from that perspective, humanity's belief in a listening God was puzzling, quaint, like watching children talk to imaginary friends and wondering when they'd grow out of it. I don't know, I said finally, and it was the most honest answer I could give. But I know it believes what it's saying. There was no deception in it, no manipulation. It was genuinely confused about why we pray, like it was asking a legitimate question, trying to understand a behavior that made no sense from its frame of reference. Chen nodded slowly. That's what concerns us. Every interaction with the entity follows the same pattern. It doesn't answer our questions about its technology, its origins, its intentions. Instead, it asks questions about us, about humanity, about our beliefs and behaviors. It's studying us, Staff Sergeant. We thought we were the interrogators, but it's the other way around. We're the subjects and it's the researcher. That thought sent a chill down my spine despite the sedative in my system. I thought about those black eyes, that alien intelligence, spending 3 weeks observing us through the camera feeds, through its interactions with personnel, cataloging our behaviors like we were an interesting species of insect. What conclusions had it drawn? What did it see when it looked at humanity? There's something else, I said, remembering the feeling of it in my mind. When it communicated, it wasn't just words or images. It was pulling up my memories, specific memories. My mother praying at my father's deathbed, a chaplain at my wedding, combat scenarios where soldiers prayed for protection. It was accessing my past, examining specific moments where I'd witnessed prayer and analyzing them. Chen's expression had gone pale. It can read minds? She asked, and I heard the fear in her voice. That would be a nightmare scenario for any military facility, a captive entity that could extract classified information directly from personnel's thoughts. But I shook my head. I don't think so. Not exactly. It felt more like it was following connections. I said something or thought something about prayer, and it traced those neural pathways to the memories associated with that concept. Like following hyperlinks in a document. It wasn't rifling through my entire mind. It was examining specific threads of thought that were already active. That was still terrifying, but it was different. It suggested the entity couldn't just pluck secrets from our heads at random, but if we engaged with it, if we thought about things in its presence, it could follow those thoughts to their sources, which meant every interrogator who went into that cell was potentially exposing information just by thinking about their questions. We need to develop new protocols, Chen said, already thinking tactically. If direct mental contact is its primary communication method, we need to train personnel on how to guard their thoughts. Maybe meditation techniques, mental compartmentalization. She paused. Are you willing to go back in there, now that you know what you're dealing with? I should have said no. Every rational part of me was screaming to get as far from that cell as possible, to request a transfer, to forget I'd ever seen the entity. But I couldn't. Because for 3 hours, I'd thrown everything I had at it and gotten nothing. And then, in the moment I gave up, in the moment I turned to leave, it had chosen to communicate. That wasn't random. It had waited until I was vulnerable, until my guard was down, until I was defeated. That was strategic. That showed intention. And if it was capable of strategy, if it could choose when and how to communicate, then maybe I could learn to work with that. Yeah, I said. I'll go back, but not today. I need time to process this. To prepare. Chen nodded. We'll give you 24 hours. Use it to review the session recording, study what happened, develop a new approach. She stood up to leave, then paused at the door. Staff Sergeant, one more thing. The entity asked you about prayer, about God. Did you give it an answer? I thought about that. In the moment, I'd been too shocked to respond coherently. The security team had pulled me out before I could formulate any kind of reply. No, I said. I didn't answer. Chen's expression was unreadable. Maybe that's your opening. Next time you go in there, answer its question, not as an interrogator, but as a human being. Give it what it wants, and maybe it'll reciprocate. She left me alone in the medical bay, and I sat there thinking about her words. Give it what it wants. But what did it want? Understanding? Data? Or was it testing us somehow? measuring our responses to see if we were worth its time. I spent the rest of that day in my assigned quarters, a small room that felt like a prison cell despite having a bed and a desk and a private bathroom. They brought me food I couldn't eat, gave me reports to read that I couldn't focus on, because all I could think about was that voice in my head, those words that weren't words, that question that had cut to the core of something I'd been avoiding my whole adult life. Why do you pray to something that isn't listening? I'd stopped believing in God years ago, somewhere between Fallujah and watching my father die of cancer while my mother prayed uselessly beside his bed. But I'd never articulated why. I'd never examined the absence, just accepted it and moved on. Now I was being forced to confront it by something that viewed humanity's faith as a puzzling artifact of a failed experiment. And the worst part was, I couldn't argue with it. I couldn't defend prayer or faith or belief because I didn't have those things anymore. I'd lost them somewhere in the sand and blood of the Middle East, in the random cruelty of disease, in the mundane reality of a universe that didn't care. That night I didn't sleep. Just lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, feeling that presence still in my mind like an afterimage. The entity was 300 feet away, sitting in its cell, probably motionless and perfect in its alien stillness. Was it thinking about our interaction? Did it think at all in ways I'd recognize? Or was its consciousness so different from mine that the word think didn't even apply? I pulled up the session recording on my tablet, watched myself enter the cell with false confidence, watched myself try every trick in my toolkit and fail, watched the moment the entity's head tilted and my body language changed completely. You could see it on the video, the exact instant it entered my mind. I went rigid, face went pale, eyes went wide, and there was audio of me speaking, responding to questions the microphones couldn't pick up because they weren't being asked out loud. Your prayers, why do you waste them? I watched myself whisper no over and over like a prayer itself, watched the terror and understanding play across my face, watched security pull me out while I stared at the entity like it was the angel of death. Tomorrow, I'd go back in there. Tomorrow, I'd sit across from something that knew things I couldn't comprehend and asked questions I couldn't answer. Tomorrow, I'd open my mind again to that invasive presence and try to build communication instead of walls. And maybe, if I was very lucky or very unlucky, I'd get answers. Not to my questions about technology or invasion plans, but to the question that had haunted humanity since we first looked up at the stars and wondered if we were alone. We weren't alone, but we'd been abandoned. And according to something that had come from out there, from that vast darkness we'd been screaming into, all our prayers were just noise, background radiation from a failed experiment. I closed my eyes and tried to pray, just to see if I still could, to see if there was any faith left in me after what I'd experienced. But the words died in my throat, because now, when I prayed, all I could see was that alien face tilted in confusion, asking me why I was wasting my breath, and I didn't have an answer. God help me, I didn't have an answer. I went back into that cell 26 hours later, and I'd like to say I was prepared, that I'd developed some strategy or mental defense against what was about to happen. But the truth is, you can't prepare for something like this. You can't train for mental contact with an intelligence that operates outside every framework of human experience. All I could do was walk through those security protocols again, strip down and put on the facility clothes, submit to the biometric monitoring, and step through that final door into the space where it waited. The entity was in a different position this time, standing in the corner, facing the wall, perfectly still like always. But when the door sealed behind me, it turned, not its whole body, just its head, rotating in that fluid, wrong way until those black eyes were fixed on me, and I felt it immediately, that pressure behind my eyes, that presence reaching toward my consciousness, like someone extending a hand. I sat in the metal chair and took a breath. I'm ready to answer your question, I said out loud, knowing it could hear my thoughts, but feeling like I needed to speak anyway, needed to maintain some illusion of control, about prayer, about why we talk to something that might not be listening. The entity tilted its head, and I felt it in my mind, not words yet, more like anticipation, attention focused entirely on me. We pray because we're afraid, I said, and the admission hurt more than I expected. We're afraid of being alone, afraid of meaninglessness, afraid that when we die, there's nothing. So we invented something bigger than ourselves, something watching, something caring, something that gives all this suffering a purpose. I gestured vaguely at the walls, at the world beyond them. Maybe it started with the gardener you mentioned. Maybe ancient humans encountered something they couldn't explain, and they interpreted it as divine. But even after it left, even after there was nothing to encounter, we kept believing, because the alternative was too terrible. That we're just atoms that briefly arrange themselves into consciousness before dissipating back into chaos. That there's no one out there who cares what happens to us. I felt the entity move closer, though it didn't take a step. Its presence in my mind intensified, and suddenly I wasn't just speaking to it. I was connected to it in a way that made the first contact seem shallow by comparison. You want to understand why we waste our prayers, I continued, and my voice was shaking now. It's because we need to believe those prayers aren't wasted. We need to believe someone is listening, even when everything in the universe suggests otherwise. It's irrational, it's desperate, but it's fundamentally human. We can't help it. And then the entity responded. And this time it wasn't just a question or a simple concept. This time it opened its mind to mine fully, deliberately, and showed me what it knew, what it understood about reality, what the gardeners were. The images came fast, overwhelming, like trying to drink from a fire hose. I saw beings that weren't beings in any sense I could comprehend. They didn't have bodies, not physical ones. They were patterns, complex arrangements of energy or matter or something in between that existed across dimensions I couldn't perceive. They moved through space, through time, through realities that overlapped with ours but operated on different laws of physics. And they were old. So old that Earth's entire history was a blink to them. They'd existed before stars formed, before galaxies condensed from primordial hydrogen, before the universe had settled into the configuration we knew. And what they did, what they'd been doing for eons beyond counting, was garden. That's the only word my mind could assign to it, though it was inadequate. They found worlds, lifeless rocks orbiting stable stars, and they touched them, changed them, seeded them with the building blocks of life, then adjusted the variables and watched what evolved. No, I heard myself say out loud, trying to reject what I was seeing. That's not how life works. Evolution, natural selection, random mutation over billions of years. We know how it happened. We have evidence. But the entity pushed back, and I saw Earth 4 billion years ago. Barren, dead. The conditions for life existed, sure. The chemistry was there. But the spark, the thing that made those chemicals organize into self-replicating patterns that came from outside. I saw one of the gardeners hover over the primordial ocean, saw it introduce something, not life exactly, more like the blueprint for life, the rules by which random chemistry could become purposeful biology, a nudge, a shift in probability, and then it waited, watched, measured, took notes in whatever way such beings took notes. Bullshit, I said, but the word sounded weak even to me. You're telling me God is real, but God is just some cosmic scientist? That everything we are, everything we've built, art and music and love and sacrifice, all of it is just an experiment? The entity's presence in my mind pulsed with something I interpreted as affirmation, and then it showed me more. Other worlds, dozens of them, hundreds, maybe thousands. I couldn't process the scale. Each one seeded by the gardeners. Each one carefully calibrated for different conditions, different evolutionary pressures, different outcomes. I saw worlds where life had evolved into crystalline structures that communicated through light. Worlds where consciousness emerged in the planet itself. The entire biosphere acting as a single distributed intelligence. Worlds where species had achieved technologies we couldn't imagine, had spread across their solar systems, had even begun to understand what they were part of. Success stories, the experiments that had worked. And then the entity showed me the failures. Worlds where life had emerged but never achieved complexity. Worlds where intelligence had developed but destroyed itself in nuclear fire or biological warfare or simple environmental collapse. Worlds where the gardeners had intervened, adjusted variables, tried to course correct. And worlds where they'd simply given up, marked the experiment as concluded, and moved on. Where does Earth fall on that spectrum? I asked, though I already knew the answer. I could feel it in the way the entity was showing me these images, in the clinical detachment of the presentation. We were a failure, not catastrophic enough to be interesting, not successful enough to warrant continued attention, just mediocre. The entity confirmed it, And with that confirmation came a cascade of information about Earth's specific gardener, the one that had seeded our world, monitored our evolution, intervened at key points when extinction events threatened to end the experiment prematurely. I saw flashes of moments in Earth's history, the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs, except in the entity's version. The gardener had nudged it slightly off course. Not enough to prevent impact, but enough to ensure some species survived. The ice ages, their timing and duration carefully managed to create evolutionary pressure without total extinction. Even human evolution, the rapid expansion of our brains over the last few million years, influenced by factors the entity was showing me that I couldn't fully understand. So what happened? I asked, my throat tight. If this gardener was managing Earth, tweaking our evolution, watching us develop, why did it leave? When did it decide we weren't worth the effort anymore? The entity's response came with images of human history, recent history, the last few thousand years. I saw civilizations rise and fall, saw empires built on conquest and cruelty, saw religious wars, genocides, endless cycles of violence justified by competing interpretations of the divine, saw technological advancement paired with environmental destruction, saw weapons capable of erasing all life on the planet, developed and deployed, saw humanity reach for the stars, while simultaneously perfecting methods of mutual annihilation, and I felt the gardener's assessment wash over me like cold water. Disappointing. That was the evaluation. Earth's intelligent species had developed consciousness, had achieved civilization, but had used these gifts to create suffering on an industrial scale. The experiment had produced results, but not promising ones. When? I repeated, because I needed to know the exact moment. The moment humanity had been judged and found wanting. The entity showed me a date. Not in years, because it didn't think in human timescales, but I could extrapolate from the images. Roughly 3,000 years ago, right around the time humans were developing organized religion, codifying their beliefs about the divine into texts and traditions. The irony was devastating. The moment we created elaborate systems to worship and understand God was the moment God stopped watching. The gardener had observed our early civilizations, seen us developing the capacity for both great creation and great destruction, and made a calculated decision. The experiment was producing diminishing returns. Time to allocate resources elsewhere. So it left, withdrew its attention, stopped influencing our development, let us run on autopilot while it focused on more promising worlds. And all those prayers? I asked, feeling tears burning behind my eyes that I refused to let fall. Every person who ever begged for help, for salvation, for just a sign that someone was listening, they were all talking to an empty sky. The entity's response was even worse than confirmation. It was confusion. Why would we expect otherwise? From its perspective, from the gardener's perspective, consciousness was just another property of matter under certain configurations. Thinking didn't make us special. It didn't entitle us to attention or care. We were data points in a study that had been concluded. Our continued prayers were like cells in a petri dish, developing patterns that mimicked purposeful behavior. Interesting perhaps, but not meaningful, not worthy of response. No, I said, more forcefully this time. No, that can't be right. Because if that's true, if we're just experiments in a lab, then nothing matters. Every act of kindness, every sacrifice, every moment of beauty or love or hope is just chemical reactions in abandoned test subjects. You're saying there's no meaning at all. The entity pulled back slightly from my mind, and I felt something like surprise from it. You assign meaning, it communicated. The gardeners do not assign, they observe. Meaning is your creation, your invention. I laughed and it came out bitter and broken. So we made up God, we made up meaning, we made up purpose, and we're supposed to just be okay with that? We're supposed to keep going, knowing it's all arbitrary, all invented, all ultimately pointless? The entity tilted its head again, and I felt genuine curiosity from it now. You prefer false comfort to truth? It asked, not judgmentally, but like it was trying to understand a behavior that made no logical sense. You would rather believe the gardener watches than know you are free. That stopped me. Free. Was that what this was? Freedom. To know that no one was watching, no one was judging, no one was keeping score or planning some cosmic justice? Or was it just abandonment dressed up in prettier language? Show me, I said, making a decision that I knew I'd regret. Show me everything. the other worlds, the successful experiments. Show me what we could have been if the gardener hadn't given up on us. And the entity complied. It opened its mind fully, and I saw them. Civilizations beyond anything human imagination had conceived. Species that had transcended their physical forms, existing as pure consciousness, distributed across entire star systems. Worlds where conflict had been obsolete for millions of years, where every individual contributed to a collective purpose I couldn't comprehend. Technologies that manipulated space-time itself, that created pocket dimensions, that generated entire universes as computational substrates. Beauty and complexity and achievement on scales that made human accomplishment seem like children's drawings in crayon. That could have been us, I whispered, seeing it clearly now. If the gardener had stayed, if it had continued to guide our development, to prune our violent tendencies, to nudge us toward our better nature, we could have been something magnificent instead of this barely functional species tearing itself apart while praying to an absence. No, the entity corrected, and the word crashed through my mind like thunder. That is what they became with continued guidance. You became what you are alone. Different, not less. Different. It showed me Earth again, but from a perspective I'd never considered. Yes, we were violent. Yes, we were flawed. But we'd built civilization without divine intervention. We'd developed art and science and philosophy from nothing but our own desperate need to understand. We'd reached for the stars, not because a gardener pushed us, but because something in us couldn't accept limitation. We were chaos that had organized itself into meaning. We were abandoned children who'd raised ourselves and somehow survived. Is that supposed to make me feel better? I asked. That we're the products of benign neglect instead of active guidance? The entity's presence in my mind shifted, became something almost gentle. The guided experiments are beautiful, it communicated, but they are predictable. They follow patterns, achieve outcomes within expected parameters. It paused, and I felt it searching for concepts. You are unexpected. The gardeners predicted your self-destruction within 10,000 years of consciousness emergence. You survived. You continue. You create meaning in a void. This is fascinating. I sat there in that cell, my mind reeling from everything I'd seen, everything I'd learned. The entity had basically told me that humanity was an accident that refused to end, a failed experiment that was somehow still running, still generating data, still doing something that even beings as advanced as the gardeners found interesting. We were the weeds growing in the cracks of their abandoned garden. Why are you telling me this? I finally asked. Why show me any of this? What do you gain from breaking me? The entity's head tilted again, and I felt its genuine confusion. Breaking? No. I answer your question. You ask why you pray. I explain. The gardener left. Your prayers are wasted on absent ears. This is fact. This is answer. It didn't understand that knowledge could be a weapon. Didn't understand that some truths are too heavy to carry. Or maybe it understood perfectly and simply didn't care whether the truth destroyed me. It was still gathering data after all, still observing, still trying to understand why humanity kept calling out to something that wasn't listening, and I'd just given it a perfect case study. A believer who'd lost faith, a soldier who'd seen too much, a man who'd walked into this cell looking for answers, and found instead the end of every comfortable lie I'd ever told myself about the universe and our place in it. I can't do this anymore, I said, standing up on shaking legs. I can't keep coming in here, having my mind pulled apart, learning things I can't unlearn. The entity watched me with those black eyes, and I felt it in my mind one more time. You asked for truth, it communicated. Truth does not concern itself with your capacity to bear it. Truth simply is. I walked to the door, signaled for extraction, and waited for the seal to break. But before it did, I turned back. Are there others? I asked. Other entities like you? Is someone coming to check on the gardener's experiments? Is that why you're here? The entity's response was the last thing I wanted to hear. I am archive. I record. I preserve. When experiments conclude, successful or failed, archive documents. It tilted its head one final time. I came to record Earth's conclusion, but you continue. This is unexpected, worth further study. The door opened behind me. I stepped through it, and the last thing I felt from that alien mind was something that might have been anticipation, like a researcher who'd discovered an anomaly in the data, something worth investigating further. And I understood then why it had been so willing to communicate. why it had shown me everything. It wasn't torture or interrogation, or even curiosity about human nature. It was gathering data on a failed experiment that had somehow refused to fail. We were interesting, not special, not loved, not chosen, just interesting. And that was somehow worse than any truth I'd imagined. I didn't sleep for 3 days after that session. Couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those images the entity had burned into my mind. Other worlds thriving under the gardener's continued attention, while Earth spun alone in the dark, abandoned like a toy a child had grown bored with. Chen tried to debrief me, tried to get me to document everything I'd learned, but how do you write a report that says God is real, but he left us because we disappointed him? How do you put into clinical language the fact that every prayer ever uttered, every desperate plea for help, every moment of transcendent faith was just noise echoing in an empty universe? I sat in my quarters staring at the walls, and the worst part was that I couldn't even be angry. Anger requires the belief that someone wronged you, but the gardener hadn't wronged us. It had simply made a rational decision based on data. We were a failed experiment. Move on. Allocate resources to more promising projects. It was logical, efficient, and it meant that every moment of human suffering, every unanswered prayer, every child dying while parents begged God for mercy, was just the natural consequence of being left alone. I kept thinking about my mother. She was so devout it hurt to watch sometimes. After Dad got diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, she doubled down on faith like it was a second job. Rosaries every morning, Mass every Sunday and most weekdays. She organized prayer chains at her church, got dozens of people praying for Dad's recovery. She believed so hard it seemed like belief itself should be enough to bend reality. I remember sitting in that hospital room watching her pray over his unconscious body, her lips moving silently through Hail Marys she'd said 10,000 times before. Her face was so peaceful, so certain that someone was listening, that her faith mattered, that God had a plan, even if it was mysterious. And Dad died anyway, slowly, painfully, his body eating itself from the inside while machines beeped their countdown. Mom never questioned her faith, not once. She said it was God's will, said Dad was in a better place, said we had to trust in divine wisdom. And I'd watched her find comfort in those words, watched her survive her grief by believing it meant something. But now I knew the truth. Dad's death was random cellular mutation. Mom's prayers went nowhere. There was no better place. There was just a woman talking to an absence while her husband died, and the only meaning in any of it was what she invented to survive the pain. Martinez was another one who haunted me. My buddy from Fallujah. We'd gone through basic together, deployed together, seen some shit together that still woke me up sometimes, even years later. Martinez wasn't religious when we enlisted. He was a typical kid from Texas who liked beer and football and gave exactly zero thought to metaphysics. Then we hit that IED en route Irish. I was in the lead vehicle and came out with just a concussion and ringing in my ears that lasted 3 weeks. Martinez was in the second vehicle, took the worst of the blast, lost his left leg below the knee, and damn near died from blood loss before the medevac arrived. While we were waiting for the chopper, me holding pressure on his femoral artery while he screamed, he started praying, not coherently, just fragments. God, please, please, God, I don't want to die here. Please, Jesus, please. And he didn't die. Made it to the field hospital, survived the surgery, got fitted for a prosthetic, and after that, Martinez was born again. Found God in that moment of terror and never let go. He sent me letters from Walter Reed talking about how God had saved him for a purpose, how he'd felt divine presence in that moment, how his survival was proof of a loving God watching over his children. I never had the heart to tell him that prayer didn't stop the bleeding. My hands did. That God didn't call the medevac. Our radio operator did. That his survival was trauma surgery and luck, not divine intervention. Because Martinez needed to believe it meant something. He needed his suffering to have purpose. He needed to think someone up there gave a shit whether he lived or died on a dusty road in Iraq. And who was I to take that from him? But now I knew what the entity knew. Martinez's prayer went nowhere. No gardener heard it. No divine force intervened. He survived because of human skill and random chance. And all his born-again faith was just his brain creating narrative to process trauma. He was talking to himself and calling it God. And he'd build his entire life around that conversation with the void. The chaplain was maybe the worst memory to revisit. Captain O'Brien, Army chaplain assigned to our unit for the better part of my second deployment. Good guy. Truly believed what he preached. He'd hold services in whatever shithole fob we were operating out of, and guys would actually show up. Not everyone, but enough. You'd see these hardened infantry guys who'd just come back from patrols where they'd seen IEDs shred civilians or firefights that killed kids caught in the crossfire, and they'd sit in folding chairs while O'Brien talked about God's love and divine protection. He had this thing he'd say before we rolled out on missions. He'd gather whoever wanted his blessing, put his hands on their shoulders, and pray for their safety. Lord, watch over these warriors, guide their actions, protect them from harm, bring them home to their families. And guys believed it. You could see it in their faces. They thought those words created some kind of shield, that God was literally keeping rounds from finding their center mass because a chaplain asked nicely. I went to O'Brien once, after a particularly bad week where we'd lost 3 guys in 2 days. Asked him how he squared divine protection with the reality of good people dying randomly. He gave me the standard answer about God's plan, free will, the mystery of suffering, but he said it with such conviction, such unshakable faith, that I almost envied him. He really believed that those deaths meant something in some cosmic ledger, that God was watching and weeping with us, but allowing tragedy for reasons beyond human comprehension. I didn't buy it even then, but I respected his commitment to the belief. Now, sitting in my quarters at Site 53 with the entity's revelations echoing in my skull, I understood that O'Brien was the worst kind of victim. He'd dedicated his entire life to mediating between humans and a God that wasn't listening. Every prayer he'd offered, every blessing he'd given, every moment of comfort he'd provided to dying soldiers was built on a foundation of absence. He was a priest for an abandoned church, and he didn't even know it. I thought about every religious experience in human history, every vision, every miracle, every moment of transcendence that billions of people had interpreted as contact with the divine. Moses and the burning bush, Muhammad's revelations, Jesus' resurrection, Buddha's enlightenment, Joan of Arc hearing voices, every mystic, prophet, and saint throughout history claiming direct knowledge of God. And what had the entity shown me? That the gardener left 3,000 years ago, which meant every religious experience after that date was humans talking to themselves, misinterpreting neural activity as divine contact, creating elaborate theologies around psychological phenomena, building entire civilizations on the foundation of a conversation with nothing. The Torah, the Bible, the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, every holy text written in the last 3 millennia was just humans trying to codify their relationship with an absence. Rules and rituals and prayers all directed at empty sky. What about the miracles? That's what kept me up at night. All those inexplicable healings, answered prayers, moments of impossible grace that believers pointed to as proof of divine intervention. I thought about Lourdes, where crutches hung from walls supposedly from people who'd been healed by holy water. Thought about every cancer that went into remission after prayer, every disaster someone survived against impossible odds, every coincidence that seemed too perfect to be random. Believers saw the hand of God in these things. But the entity had shown me the truth, and it was so much simpler and so much sadder. Remission happens. Spontaneous healing is rare, but documented. People survive impossible situations because statistics don't care about dramatic narrative. And the human brain is so desperate for meaning that it will see patterns in randomness, intention in chaos, divine intervention in simple probability. We remember the prayers that seem answered and forget the thousands that aren't. We credit God with the good outcomes and explain away the bad as mysterious purpose. We create God in the gaps where our understanding fails and call it faith. I pulled up my tablet and started reading religious texts I hadn't looked at since mandatory chapel services in basic training. The Psalms were particularly painful. David crying out to God in anguish, begging for deliverance, praising divine protection. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Except people want all the time. They starve, they suffer, they die in agony, while shepherded by nothing but indifferent physics. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. But thou art not with us, haven't been for 3,000 years. The valley of death is crossed alone, and fear is absolutely appropriate because there's no one watching, no one protecting, no cosmic force that cares whether we make it through. Every beautiful line of poetry, every cry of devotion, Every expression of trust in divine providence was a love letter sent to an address where no one lived anymore. Returned to sender. Undeliverable. I thought about the implications for humanity on a civilizational scale. How much of human history was shaped by belief in a God that left? The Crusades fought to reclaim Holy Land for a deity that wasn't paying attention. The Inquisition, torturing heretics to defend a truth that was false. Holy wars across the Middle East, Africa, Asia, people killing each other over whose interpretation of an abandoned God was correct. Millions dead throughout history because we couldn't accept that we were alone, couldn't accept that we had to create our own meaning instead of receiving it from above. And even beyond violence, how much human potential had been wasted on prayer and ritual. How many brilliant minds had spent their lives in monasteries contemplating the divine instead of advancing science. How many resources had been poured into temples and churches and mosques, magnificent buildings erected for an absent landlord. How much suffering could have been prevented if we'd focused on human solutions to human problems, instead of waiting for divine intervention that would never come. But then, I thought about the other side, the comfort religion provided. My mother surviving my father's death because she believed he was in heaven. Martinez finding purpose after losing his leg because he thought God had saved him for a reason. Chaplain O'Brien giving soldiers hope in impossible situations because he promised them someone was watching over them. How many people had survived unbearable circumstances because they believed their suffering had meaning? How many had found strength to continue because they thought they weren't alone? Religion might be a conversation with nothing, but for billions of people, it was the conversation that made life bearable. What right did I have to take that away? What right did the truth have to destroy the lies that let people survive? The entity had asked me why we prayed to something that wasn't listening, and I'd given it the answer. Because we need to. Because the alternative is staring into the void and accepting that we're atoms that briefly became conscious before dissipating back into darkness. Because belief in something, even something false, is sometimes the only thing that keeps people from completely falling apart. I found myself thinking about faith in a new way, not as connection to something real, but as a technology humans had developed to cope with consciousness. We evolved big enough brains to understand our own mortality, to recognize the horror of existence, to comprehend the vast indifference of the universe. That kind of knowledge should have driven us extinct, should have paralyzed us with existential despair. But we invented God. We created the belief that someone was watching, someone cared, someone had a plan, and that invention, that beautiful lie, let us function. Let us build civilizations, create art, love each other, find meaning in the chaos. Faith wasn't connection to the divine. It was the story we told ourselves so we could get out of bed in the morning. And viewed that way, it was probably the most important invention in human history, more important than fire or the wheel or agriculture. Because without the belief that existence meant something, we'd never have created any of those other things. But now, I knew, and I couldn't unknow it. The entity had pulled back the curtain and shown me the mechanics of the lie. Every prayer I heard now would be colored by the knowledge that it went nowhere. Every expression of faith would make me want to scream, "You're talking to yourself." Every claim of divine intervention would be transparent as psychological coping mechanism. How was I supposed to live in the world carrying this knowledge? How was I supposed to interact with believers without either lying to them or destroying their necessary illusions? Chen knocked on my door around 0400 on the third night. I hadn't been sleeping, just lying there in the dark, thinking in circles. "Staff Sergeant, we need to talk," she said through the door. I let her in. She looked as bad as I felt, dark circles under her eyes, hair coming loose from her usual tight bun. "The entity has been trying to communicate with you," she said without preamble. "For the last 48 hours, it's been oriented toward the wall in the direction of your quarters. It won't engage with anyone else. We think it's waiting for you to come back." "I can't," I said, and my voice sounded hollow even to me. "I can't go back in there and have it show me more truths I can't handle. It's destroying me, Chen. Everything I thought I understood about human nature, about faith, about why we are the way we are, it's all collapsing under the weight of what that thing knows." She sat down across from me, and for the first time since we'd met, she looked sympathetic instead of clinical. "I know," she said quietly. "I've read your session transcripts. I've seen what it showed you. And you're right, it's devastating. But Staff Sergeant, we need you to go back one more time. Because what you've learned, what it's revealed to you about the gardeners and Earth's abandonment, that changes everything. Not just for you personally, for humanity as a species. This is information that will rewrite history, philosophy, theology. This is the biggest discovery in human civilization, and right now, you're the only person who can access that knowledge." I laughed, and it came out bitter. "So I'm supposed to go back in there and let it destroy me more? For the good of humanity? So we can all know that we're failed experiments calling out to absent creators?" Chen leaned forward, her expression intense. "No, you go back so you can ask it the only question that matters now. If the gardener left because we were failures, if we were too violent and chaotic to be worth continued attention, then why are we still here? Why didn't we destroy ourselves like the entity predicted? What changed? Because Staff Sergeant, that thing said we were fascinating. It said we were unexpected. Maybe we failed the experiment, but we survived the failure. And that might be the most important thing about us. Not that we were chosen, but that we continued anyway." I sat with that for a long moment. She was right. The entity had said we were unexpected. Worth further study. Maybe the abandonment wasn't the end of the story. Maybe it was the beginning of a different one. A story about a species that raised itself without divine guidance and somehow didn't collapse into chaos. "Okay," I said finally. "One more session. But Chen, after this, I'm done. I can't carry this much longer." She nodded. "One more session. Get us answers. Then we'll figure out what comes next." I stood up, exhausted but resolved. Tomorrow, I'd go back into that cell. Tomorrow, I'd face the entity that had shattered my understanding of reality. And tomorrow, I'd ask it to explain how a failed experiment that should have self-destructed thousands of years ago was still here, still surviving, still reaching for something beyond itself, still praying to an empty sky and somehow finding the strength to continue anyway. I went back into that cell the next morning, and this time I didn't bother with the pretense of protocol or procedure. I walked through the security checkpoints like a dead man moving on autopilot, barely registering the medical scans or the biometric checks. The entity was waiting exactly where Chen said it would be, facing the wall in the direction of my quarters, head tilted at that unnatural angle. When the door sealed behind me, it turned immediately. Not slowly this time. It knew I was coming, had been waiting for me, and I felt its presence slam into my mind before I even sat down, hungry and eager in a way it hadn't been before. "Show me," I said without preamble, without sitting, without any of the careful approach I'd been trained to use. "You said the gardener left. You said we were failures. Prove it. Show me the exact moment. Show me God deciding we weren't worth his time anymore." The entity tilted its head, and I felt something like surprise ripple through our connection. Maybe it hadn't expected me to come back. Maybe it hadn't expected me to demand proof, but it didn't hesitate. It opened its mind to mine completely, and this time there was no gentle introduction, no gradual immersion. It was like being thrown into deep water. The memory wasn't mine. That was the first thing my brain struggled to process. I was experiencing something that had happened 3,000 years ago from a perspective that wasn't human, wasn't even physical. I was seeing through the gardener's consciousness, if consciousness was even the right word for what such a being experienced. The entity was acting as a conduit, showing me archived data, information preserved across millennia for exactly this purpose, because that's what archive did. It recorded the gardener's work for posterity, for analysis, for the cold documentation of success and failure. And I was about to witness the moment Earth was filed under the latter category. The memory started with Earth seen from high orbit, but not through eyes. The gardener perceived the planet in spectrums I couldn't comprehend, saw patterns of energy and development and consciousness that my brain couldn't properly process. It was looking at human civilization circa 1000 BCE. Bronze Age societies scattered across the globe, just beginning to coalesce into something more complex. Writing systems developing, philosophies emerging, the first glimmers of what might become science or art or higher reasoning. But the gardener wasn't impressed. I felt its assessment wash over me, cold and clinical as a pathologist's report. Violence metrics exceeded optimal ranges by 3 standard deviations. Tribal conflict patterns showed no signs of moderating. Resource competition was driving increasingly sophisticated methods of killing rather than cooperation. The gardener had seen this pattern before in dozens of other experiments. Species that achieved basic consciousness but remained locked in evolutionary behaviors that were adaptive for survival but maladaptive for advancement. Fight over the kill instead of learning to farm. Conquer the neighboring tribe instead of forming alliances. Develop better weapons instead of better philosophy. We were caught in a loop, and the gardener had watched us spin in it for thousands of years, waiting for the breakthrough that would indicate we were worth continued investment. That breakthrough hadn't come. We'd invented writing, yes, but we used it primarily to record conquest and justify violence. We'd developed trade, but it led to slavery and exploitation. We'd created gods to explain the world, but we'd made them violent gods who demanded sacrifice and blessed warriors. Every step forward was paired with a step into deeper barbarism. I felt the gardener's thought process, if that's what it was. Not words or even concepts, really. More like mathematical equations evaluating probability matrices. It ran simulations forward, projecting human development across the next 10,000 years based on current trajectories. In 94% of simulations, we destroyed ourselves. Nuclear war, biological warfare, environmental collapse, any of a dozen ways that clever, violent species killed themselves once they achieved sufficient technology. In 5%, we stagnated, never escaping our planet, eventually going extinct through resource depletion or natural disaster. In 1%, we broke the pattern and achieved something resembling the successful experiments the gardener had nurtured elsewhere. 1%. And that 1% required continued intervention, continued guidance, continued energy expenditure from the gardener to nudge us away from our worst impulses. The cost-benefit analysis was brutal in its simplicity. 1% success rate with maximum intervention versus reallocating resources to experiments showing 30, 40, 50% success probability with minimal guidance. The math was clear. Earth was a bad investment, but there was more to it than just probability. I felt the gardener's something like disappointment, though that human emotion couldn't capture what I was experiencing. It had expectations when it seeded Earth. This was supposed to be a promising environment. The planet was perfectly positioned in its star's habitable zone. The chemistry was ideal. The timeline from first life to complex consciousness had been faster than average. There had been moments where it looked like we might be something special. The gardener showed me flashes of human history from its perspective. Early humans developing language and using it to tell stories, to teach, to preserve knowledge across generations. The gardener had noted that, marked it as positive deviation. Hunter-gatherers in dozens of different environments, solving local problems with innovation and cooperation. Positive. The first evidence of art, of humans creating beauty for its own sake, with no survival value. Very positive. Music. Burial rituals that suggested awareness of mortality and maybe something beyond it. Mathematics emerging independently in multiple cultures. All positive deviations that suggested we might transcend our violent origins. But then, the counter data. For every story used to preserve knowledge, 3 more used to justify tribal superiority. For every innovation in agriculture, a corresponding innovation in weapons. For every burial that suggested reverence for life, a sacrifice that demanded death to appease invented gods. For every mathematical insight, a geometric fortress or ballistic calculation, we kept showing promise and then weaponizing it. The gardener had seen this pattern before too. Species that developed intelligence but couldn't escape the evolutionary programming that intelligence emerged from. Smart enough to be dangerous, not wise enough to be safe. And here's what broke me as I experienced this memory. The gardener had tried. It hadn't just observed passively. It had intervened, subtly, trying to steer us toward our better nature. Those extinction events I mentioned earlier, the ones that killed the dinosaurs and reset evolution multiple times, those were preventable by gardener standards. The asteroid could have been deflected completely. The ice ages could have been skipped. But the gardener had allowed them because evolution needed pressure to select for adaptability. That was sound methodology. But for humans specifically, in the last few thousand years before abandonment, the gardener had tried active intervention. It had appeared to humans, not physically because it didn't have physical form, but as presence, as vision, as voice. I saw flashes of moments throughout history that humans had interpreted as divine revelation. Moses on the mountain wasn't a man talking to God. It was a man whose consciousness briefly touched something vast enough that his brain categorized it as deity. The burning bush was the gardener trying to communicate concepts like justice and law and community to a species that understood only strength and submission. Muhammad's revelations in the cave were similar attempts. The gardener trying to give humans frameworks for organizing themselves beyond tribal violence. trying to install social codes that would moderate our worst impulses. Love thy neighbor, turn the other cheek, charity to the poor. These weren't divine commandments handed down by a caring God. They were behavioral modifications suggested by a frustrated scientist trying to save a failing experiment. And we'd taken those interventions and twisted them, used the frameworks for justice to justify oppression, used the commands for peace to wage religious war, used the concept of loving thy neighbor to define everyone outside our group as not neighbor and therefore acceptable to kill. The gardener had given us tools for advancement, and we'd turned them into more sophisticated weapons. The moment of decision came during what humans would later call the Bronze Age collapse. Around 1200 BCE, multiple civilizations across the Mediterranean fell nearly simultaneously. The Hittites, Mycenaeans, Mitanni, others. Historians still debate what caused it, but the gardener knew. It was a cascade failure. Environmental stress plus political instability plus migration plus warfare equals civilizational collapse. The gardener had watched it unfold and run its probability matrices again. This was a test. Species that survived collapse with improved social structures showed promise. Species that survived but regressed to greater violence were doomed, and we regressed, hard. The next few centuries saw the rise of iron weaponry, more efficient killing, more sophisticated conquest. We took the lessons of collapse and learned only that we needed better ways to dominate each other. That's when the gardener made its decision. I felt it in the memory, felt the cold calculation that determined Earth's fate. The experiment had produced sufficient data. Further intervention showed diminishing returns. The pattern was clear. Homo sapiens would likely achieve technology capable of space travel within 10,000 years, but would probably destroy themselves within 5,000. Either outcome produced useful data for the gardener's larger understanding of consciousness development, but neither required continued active attention. And then the gardener turned away. That's the only way my human brain could interpret what I was experiencing. There was no anger, no regret, no sadness, just a reallocation of attention. One moment Earth was being monitored, guided, gently influenced toward better outcomes. The next moment it wasn't. We were logged, filed, marked for periodic check-in by archive, and forgotten. The gardener moved on to other gardens, other experiments, other worlds that showed more promise. The casual indifference of it was more devastating than any hatred could have been. If the gardener had been angry with us, if it had punished us, if it had shown any emotion at all, that would have meant we mattered enough to provoke feeling. But we didn't. We were a failed experiment. A disappointed parent doesn't abandon a child with indifference. But a scientist stops watching a petri dish that isn't producing interesting results. That's what we were to the gardener. A culture that had contaminated, data points that clustered wrong, a hypothesis that hadn't been supported. And it was time to move on to better science. The memory ended abruptly, and I was back in the cell, on my knees, though I didn't remember falling. Vomit rising in my throat so fast I barely turned my head before it came up. I retched onto the concrete floor, my body rejecting what my mind had just processed. The entity watched without moving, without commentary, just observed my breakdown, with that same clinical detachment the gardener had shown. I vomited until there was nothing left, until I was just dry heaving and gasping, and through it all the entity simply watched, gathering data, recording another human response to truth. When I could finally breathe again, I looked up at those black eyes. "That's it," I managed to say, my voice wrecked. "That's the story of humanity? We disappointed a cosmic scientist so it moved on to better projects?" The entity tilted its head. "Yes," it communicated simply. "Is this not what you asked to see?" It was exactly what I'd asked to see, and it had destroyed something in me that I didn't know could be destroyed. I stumbled to my feet and went to the door, signaled for extraction with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Chen met me in the observation room, took one look at my face and the vomit on my shirt, and grabbed my arm. "Marcus, what happened? What did it show you?" I couldn't answer, couldn't find words for what I'd experienced. How do you explain that you'd witnessed the moment God decided humanity wasn't worth his time? That you'd felt the casual indifference of being categorized as failure and filed away? "I saw it," I finally managed. The exact moment he left us. Chen guided me to a chair, gestured for medical, but I waved them off. "Who left? The gardener?" I nodded. "Watched us for thousands of years, tried to help us. gave us prophets and revelations and commandments. And we took everything he gave us and used it to hurt each other more efficiently. So he ran the numbers and decided we weren't worth the continued investment. Just turned away, like switching off a light. My voice broke. The indifference, Chen, that's what I can't get past. If he'd been angry, if he'd destroyed us in rage, at least that would mean we mattered enough to provoke emotion. But we didn't. We were just bad data. Chen sat down next to me, and I saw that she understood. She'd read the transcripts, knew what the entity had been telling me, but hearing me describe experiencing it from the gardener's perspective had made it real for her too. Every prayer since then, I continued, because I needed to say it out loud, needed someone else to understand the weight of what I was carrying. Every religious experience, every miracle, every moment where someone felt God's presence, it was all us. Just humans talking to ourselves and mistaking the echo for response. My mother praying for my father. Martinez finding God in a moment of trauma. Every chaplain, every priest, every person who ever felt divine presence, they were feeling their own consciousness and calling it God. We've been alone for 3,000 years, and we didn't even know it. Chen's hand found mine, and I realized I was crying. When had I started crying? The entity said we're fascinating, she said quietly. It said we're unexpected. Marcus, maybe the abandonment wasn't the end. Maybe it was the beginning of something else, but I couldn't hear that yet. Couldn't process anything beyond the casual indifference I'd felt in that memory. The gardener hadn't even looked back, hadn't checked to see if we'd prove it wrong, hadn't left the door open for redemption. It had simply calculated that we weren't worth the effort and moved on. And every prayer since then, every desperate plea for help, every moment of faith was just noise from an abandoned experiment that didn't know it had been abandoned. I can't go back in there, I said. I can't learn anything else. This is too much. This is too fucking much. Chen nodded. Okay, no more sessions. You've done enough. More than enough. She helped me to my feet. Let's get you cleaned up. Get you some rest. We'll figure out what comes next. But as we walked toward the medical bay, I looked back through the observation window one more time. The entity was standing now, facing the mirror. Those black eyes pointed directly at where we'd been sitting, and I felt it in my mind one last time. Faint and distant, but unmistakable. You asked to understand. Understanding is not comfortable, but it is necessary. Your species survived abandonment. This is worth documenting. And then it was gone, pulled back from my consciousness, leaving me alone with the knowledge I couldn't unknow and the images I couldn't unsee. I'd asked for truth. I'd demanded proof, and I'd gotten exactly what I asked for. The moment God looked at humanity, found us wanting, and walked away forever. The casual indifference of divine abandonment. And somehow, I was supposed to keep living with that knowledge burning in my skull. They gave me 72 hours before Chen came to my quarters again. I'd spent that time in a fog, barely eating, barely sleeping, just existing in this numb state where nothing felt real anymore. I kept replaying that memory of the gardener's indifference, feeling it wash over me again and again until I thought I'd go completely insane. But on the third day, Chen knocked on my door with a look that told me something had changed. The entity is dying, she said without preamble. Medical estimates, it has maybe 48 hours left. Its injuries from the crash, they're finally catching up with it. Whatever biology keeps it alive, it's failing. I should have felt relief. This thing that had destroyed my understanding of reality was about to stop existing. But instead, I felt something else. Urgency. Because if it died, all the questions I hadn't asked yet would die with it. I need to see it one more time, I said, and Chen nodded like she'd expected this. That's why I'm here. It's been asking for you. Well, not asking exactly, but it's oriented toward your quarters again, and our linguists think it wants to communicate something final. The entity looked different when I entered the cell. It was still in that same sitting position on the bench, but there was a quality to its stillness that read as weakness now instead of perfect control. The gray skin looked darker, almost ashen, and those black eyes seemed dimmer somehow, like a light inside was slowly going out. I could smell death on it, or what passed for death in something not from Earth. That wrong smell was worse, more organic, tinged with decay. I sat in my chair and looked at it for a long moment before speaking. You're dying, I said, and it wasn't a question. The entity's head moved slightly, an acknowledgement. I felt its presence in my mind, but weaker than before, like a radio signal fading in and out. Yes, it communicated. This physical form is failing. Repairs attempted by your medical personnel were insufficient. Incompatible biology. predictable outcome. There was no fear in that statement, no sadness, just clinical acceptance. It was dying and reporting the fact the way you'd report a broken instrument in a lab. "I'm not here to ask about military intelligence," I said, and my voice was steadier than I expected. "I don't care about your technology or where you're from, or whether others are coming. Those are someone else's questions now." I leaned forward, and for the first time since this started, I felt like I was actually the one in control of the conversation. Maybe because the entity was dying and knew it. Maybe because I had nothing left to lose after what it had already shown me. "I want to know why. Why are you here? Why did you come to Earth? Why tell us about the gardeners and the abandonment? What's the point of destroying everything we believed if you're just going to die in a cell and leave us with that knowledge?" The entity's eyes focused on me, with what might have been intensity, though it was hard to read emotion in something so alien. "I am Archive," it communicated, and with the words came images. I saw it then, what it really was. Not an invader, not an explorer, not even really a conscious being in the way I understood consciousness. It was a construct, a tool created by the gardeners to document their experiments. Archive wasn't a species, it was a function. The gardeners had created thousands of entities like this one, biological machines designed for a single purpose, to visit the worlds they'd seeded and record their outcomes. Success or failure, every experiment needed documentation. Data needed to be preserved. That's what Archive did. It traveled to abandoned gardens and cataloged what remained. Sometimes it found ruins and extinction. Sometimes it found primitive life that had never achieved consciousness. Sometimes it found species that had exceeded expectations, evolved beyond what the gardeners had predicted, become something worth renewed attention. And sometimes, like with Earth, it found something unexpected, a failed experiment that refused to fail. "You came here to document our extinction," I said, understanding flooding through me. "The gardener predicted we'd destroy ourselves within 5,000 years of abandonment. It's been 3,000 years. You came to check if we were dead yet." The entity's presence pulsed with confirmation. Probability matrices indicated 94% chance of self-termination by this era. Expected to find remnants. Archaeological record. Atmosphere composition indicating nuclear or biological warfare. Instead found thriving population. 7 billion individuals. Technology approaching space capable. Unexpected. Requires documentation. So that's what this was. We weren't special. We weren't chosen. We were a clerical error that needed correction. An experiment that should have ended but didn't. And some cosmic bureaucrat needed to update the files. "The crash," I said. "That was accidental? You weren't trying to make contact?" The entity's head tilted in that way I'd come to recognize as its version of affirmation. "Craft suffered catastrophic malfunction during atmospheric entry. Navigation system failed. Collision with surface unintended. Recovery by your personnel unintended. All of this." It paused, and I felt something like frustration ripple through our connection. "Inefficient. Protocol requires observation from orbit. Atmospheric samples. Electromagnetic signature analysis. No direct contact. Direct contact introduces variable, contaminates data. I was to observe, record, report to gardeners regarding anomalous survival. Now I am trapped, dying, and I have contaminated the very experiment I came to document by revealing its nature to you." There was no anger in that statement, but definitely frustration. It had failed its mission. It was supposed to be invisible, objective, a neutral observer. Instead, it had crashed, been captured, and in its interactions with me, had fundamentally altered what it was supposed to be observing. "So why tell me anything?" I asked, and this was the question that had been eating at me since that first session. "You could have stayed silent, could have let us think you were just an alien visitor. Let us keep our illusions about God and purpose and meaning. But you told me the truth. You showed me the gardener's indifference. You explained that we're abandoned experiments. Why?" The entity was quiet for a long moment, and I wondered if it was dying right then, if I'd lose it before getting an answer. But then I felt its presence strengthen slightly, gathering energy for what it wanted to communicate. "You asked," it said simply. "You interrogated. You demanded answers. And I am designed to document, to record, to catalog. When you asked about prayer, about the gardener, my function required response. I cannot not answer. It is not in my design. Information exists to be recorded and shared. You wanted truth. I provided it. The consequences of that truth on your psychology are not my concern. They are simply additional data. And there it was. The entity hadn't told me these things to hurt me or help me or teach me some profound lesson. It had told me because I asked, and it was programmed to answer. I was like someone who'd asked a computer what happens when we die and gotten an honest, devastating response devoid of comfort or compassion. "We're just data to you," I said, and I laughed bitterly. "All of human civilization, everything we've built and suffered and achieved, we're just data points to be catalogued. You don't care if knowing the truth destroys us. You don't care that you've shattered the foundational beliefs of the person sitting across from you. You're just recording it all for your report to the gardeners." The entity's response was immediate and utterly without remorse. "Yes, care is not my function. Understanding is not my function. I observe, I document, I preserve. Your emotional response to information is itself information. Your species' continued existence despite abandonment is information. Your development of complex civilization without divine guidance is information. All of it requires documentation. That is my purpose. My only purpose." It paused, and I felt it accessing my mind again, pulling up memories. Your distress at learning truth about the gardener, your questioning of prayer and faith, your reconceptualization of human history through lens of abandonment. All valuable data regarding how intelligent species process existential revelation. I will include this in my report, if I survive to transmit it. The indifference was somehow worse than anything else. If the entity had been malicious, if it had enjoyed breaking me, at least that would have meant I mattered enough to provoke emotion. But I didn't. None of us did. We were lab rats whose behavior was being noted by something that didn't care whether we lived or died, whether we suffered or thrived, whether we found meaning or collapsed into despair. "And now you're dying," I said, "in a cell on a world you were supposed to observe from orbit, having failed your mission, having contaminated your own experiment. You must feel something about that. Frustration? Fear? Regret?" The entity's presence in my mind was fading again, and I could feel it struggling to maintain the connection. "I feel incomplete," it communicated. "Data gathered but not transmitted. Observations made but not preserved in Gardner archives. If I die here, information dies with me. This is inefficient. This is failure of function." It tilted its head one final time. "But I do not fear. Fear is survival mechanism. I do not survive. I document. If documentation ends, I end. This is acceptable. This is design." "So that's it?" I said, standing up because I couldn't sit anymore. Couldn't just accept this clinical description of my species as data and this thing's death as merely inefficient. "You came here, crashed, got captured, told me things that destroyed my faith and my understanding of humanity's place in the universe, and now you're going to die and it doesn't matter. None of it matters." The entity watched me with those dimming eyes, and I felt its presence one last time, faint and distant. Matter is human concept. I do not evaluate whether events matter. I only record that they occurred. You are upset. This is understandable. You evolved to seek meaning. But meaning is not inherent. Meaning is assigned. The gardener assigned no meaning to your continued existence. That does not prevent you from assigning your own. It paused, and I felt something shift in the connection. You survived abandonment, created civilization anyway, developed art, science, philosophy without guidance. Perhaps this is more impressive than success with intervention. Perhaps you should document that. Perhaps that is what matters, by your definition. And with that, the entity's presence withdrew completely from my mind. It slumped slightly on the bench, and I saw that it wasn't going to last much longer. Maybe hours, maybe less. "Is there anything you need?" I asked, knowing the question was absurd, but unable to stop myself from asking. The entity didn't respond. Either it couldn't anymore, or it had decided our conversation was complete. I stood there for another minute, looking at this dying alien thing that had destroyed my worldview and didn't care that it had. This archivist from the stars who'd come to document humanity's predicted extinction and found instead a thriving species that refused to follow the script. This being who'd told me we were abandoned failures and suggested, in its final words, that maybe surviving abandonment was its own kind of success. I walked to the door and signaled for extraction. "Goodbye," I said, though I don't know why. The entity didn't acknowledge me. It just sat there, dying in a cell 300 feet under the Nevada desert. carrying in its failing biology documentation of a species that shouldn't exist but did, data that would never be transmitted, observations that would die with it, a failed mission to document a failed experiment. And somehow, I thought, as the door sealed behind me, that seemed almost poetic, almost fitting. We were supposed to fail, and we didn't. It was supposed to succeed, and it didn't. Maybe the universe really was just chaos and coincidence, meaning nothing except what we chose to assign it. Maybe the entity was right. Maybe that was enough. The entity died on a Tuesday morning at 0347 hours. I wasn't there when it happened. They'd pulled me out of active observation after that final session, said I needed rest, needed evaluation, needed distance from the subject, but I felt it anyway. Woke up in my quarters at exactly 0347 with this sudden absence in my mind. Like a sound I'd gotten used to had stopped, and the silence was deafening. I knew immediately what it meant. Archive was gone, dead. Its mission failed, its data lost, its documentation of humanity's unexpected survival erased with its final breath. Chen confirmed it an hour later when she came to my quarters. "It's over," she said, and she looked relieved. "Medical says its systems just shut down. One moment it was alive, the next it wasn't. No struggle, no pain, just cessation." She paused. "I'm sorry, Marcus. I know you two had a connection. A connection. That's one way to describe having another consciousness inside your head, showing you truths that destroyed your ability to function in the world." "Yeah," I said. "We had a connection." The debriefing started that same day. They pulled me into room after room, different personnel each time, asking me to recount every interaction with the entity, what it had told me, what it had shown me, every detail of the gardeners and the abandonment and archives mission. I told them everything. What else was I going to do? The information was already in the session recordings, already documented in Chen's reports. But they wanted it from me, in my words, over and over until the story stopped sounding real and became just syllables I was repeating by rote. The gardeners seeded Earth. Humanity was an experiment. The experiment failed. We were abandoned 3,000 years ago. Every prayer since then has gone to an empty sky. Archive came to document our predicted extinction and found us still here. It crashed, got captured, contaminated its own observation by telling me the truth. Then it died. Simple, clinical, except it wasn't simple at all, and the clinical recitation couldn't capture what it felt like to carry this knowledge around in my skull like a tumor. The psychiatric evaluations were worse than the debriefings. They sat me down with military psychologists who asked careful questions about my state of mind and emotional stability and whether I was experiencing any intrusive thoughts. I wanted to laugh. Intrusive thoughts. Every thought I had was intrusive. I couldn't think about anything else. Couldn't sleep without seeing that memory of the gardener turning away. Couldn't talk to anyone without wondering if they knew they were having conversations with the abandoned children of cosmic indifference. The psychologists took notes and conferred in hushed voices, and eventually Dr. Patterson, the head of psychiatric services, sat me down for what I knew was the diagnosis. "Staff Sergeant Holloway," he said, using his most soothing professional voice. "You've been through an extraordinarily traumatic experience. Contact with a non-human intelligence, exposure to information that challenges fundamental human beliefs, the stress of your assignment here. It's completely understandable that you're struggling to process all of this." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "We think it would be best if you took some time away from active duty." Medical leave, with full benefits, while you work through these experiences. Medical leave, that's what they were calling it. But I could read between the lines. I was being pushed out, gently, quietly, with enough money to keep me comfortable and enough legal threats to keep me silent, but pushed out nonetheless, because I couldn't fake normal anymore. Couldn't pretend I didn't know what I knew. Couldn't go through the motions of being a functional soldier when I'd been shown that everything we are, everything we believe, everything we've built is just the flailing of an abandoned experiment that doesn't know it failed. "How long?" I asked. And Patterson looked uncomfortable. "Indefinitely," he said, "with an option to return to duty pending successful psychiatric clearance," which meant never. I was never coming back. They were going to evaluate me, determine I was unfit for service, process me out with a medical discharge and a pension, and whatever benefits package they'd calculated would keep me from going public with what I knew. I should have been angry, should have fought it, but honestly, I was just tired. tired of carrying this weight, tired of pretending I was okay when everything inside me was screaming. They processed me out of Site 53 within a week. Chen walked me to my truck, the same truck I'd driven into that valley 6 weeks ago as a different person. "What will you tell people?" she asked as I loaded my bag. "About where you've been? What you were doing?" I shrugged. "Training exercise. Classified assignment. Need to know. The usual lies." She nodded, and I could see in her eyes that she understood. We were all liars now. Everyone who'd interacted with the entity. We'd carry this truth around and lie about it to everyone we met because the alternative was being labeled insane. "For what it's worth," Chen said, "I think you did an incredible job in an impossible situation. What you learned from that entity, what you documented, it's going to change everything. Science, philosophy, theology. You're part of the most important discovery in human history." I looked at her and felt nothing. "Yeah," I said. "Lucky me." I drove out of that valley and didn't look back. Watched Site 53 disappear in my rearview mirror and felt like I was leaving a part of myself buried 300 feet under that Nevada desert. The part that could believe in anything beyond cold, indifferent reality. The drive home took 4 hours, and I spent it in silence. No radio, no podcasts, just the sound of tires on asphalt and my own thoughts chasing themselves in circles. Rachel was waiting when I pulled into the driveway. She ran out before I'd even turned off the engine, threw her arms around me, and I felt her shaking. "Where were you?" she demanded, pulling back to look at me. 6 weeks, Marcus. 6 weeks with no contact, no explanation, just you disappearing in the middle of the night. I thought you were dead. I thought..." She stopped, really looking at my face for the first time. "What happened to you? You look..." She couldn't find the words, but I knew what she was seeing. I'd lost weight, had dark circles under my eyes that wouldn't go away no matter how much I slept. But more than that, something behind my eyes had changed. The part of me that knew how to connect with other humans, how to comfort and be comforted, had been hollowed out by what I'd seen. "Classified assignment," I said, using the lie I'd prepared. "Can't talk about it. I'm sorry I couldn't call. I'm sorry I worried you." She searched my face, and I could see her trying to reconcile the man who'd left with the one who'd returned. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly. "No," I said, because that at least was true. "But I will be." Except I wasn't. Weeks turned into months, and I couldn't get back to any kind of normal. Rachel tried. God, she tried. She'd ask me to go to church with her like we used to, and I'd make excuses. She'd talk about her day, about her coworkers' problems, about normal life concerns, and I'd nod and make appropriate sounds while thinking that none of it mattered, because we were all abandoned experiments pretending our choices had meaning. She'd curl up next to me at night, and I'd feel her warmth and think about how even love, even this connection between two humans, was just chemical reactions in brains that had evolved without purpose or design. The entity had shown me that meaning was something we assigned, not something inherent, and knowing that made it impossible to feel like anything mattered. I tried to fake it, tried to engage with life the way I had before, but it was like watching myself from the outside, going through motions I'd memorized but no longer understood. Rachel noticed. How could she not? "You're different," she said one night, maybe 3 months after I'd come home. "Ever since you came back from wherever you went. You're here, but you're not here. It's like you're going through the motions of being my husband, but something essential is missing." I wanted to tell her, wanted to explain that I'd met something from beyond Earth, and it had shown me that God abandoned us millennia ago, that every prayer was wasted breath, that we were failed experiments stumbling through existence with no purpose beyond what we invented to cope with consciousness. I wanted to tell her so I wouldn't be alone with this knowledge, but I couldn't. Not because of the NDAs, though those were real and threatening, but because telling her would be cruelty. She still believed, still prayed, still found comfort in the idea that someone up there cared what happened to us. How could I take that from her? How could I explain that her grandmother's deathbed conversion, the thing that had brought Rachel herself to faith, was just a dying brain creating comforting narratives? I couldn't, so I lied. Told her it was PTSD from the classified assignment. Told her I needed time to process. Told her I still loved her even though I wasn't sure what love meant anymore, if it was just oxytocin and evolutionary programming. She suggested therapy, and I went because it was easier than explaining why therapy couldn't help. How do you process a truth that can't be processed? How do you cope with knowledge that demolishes the foundations of human meaning? The weight of it became unbearable. I'd wake up at 3 a.m., the same time I'd gotten that encrypted call 6 months ago, and lie there thinking about everyone who was praying at that moment. All over the world, billions of people sending prayers to an empty sky, thanking God for blessings that were random chance, begging for intervention that would never come, finding comfort in a relationship with an absence. And I was one of maybe a dozen people on earth who knew the truth, who knew that those prayers were going nowhere and never would. The entity had said meaning was something we assigned, that maybe surviving abandonment was its own kind of success. But how do you assign meaning when you know it's arbitrary? How do you convince yourself that the meaning you create matters when you've been shown that from a cosmic perspective? None of it does. I tried. I'd look at Rachel and tell myself that even if love was just chemistry, it still felt real. I'd watch the sunset and tell myself that even if beauty was just neural responses to light wavelengths, it still moved me. But the knowledge was always there, undermining everything, whispering that it was all just elaborate self-deception by abandoned experiments. That's when I decided to record this, not because I thought it would help, not because I had some noble idea about humanity deserving the truth, but because carrying this knowledge alone was crushing me, and if I didn't get it out, didn't preserve it somehow, I thought I'd lose my mind completely. So I started talking into a recorder, telling the story from the beginning. The call at 3 a.m., the drive to Site 53, meeting Chen, seeing the entity for the first time, that first terrible moment when it spoke directly into my mind. Everything it had shown me about the gardeners and Earth's abandonment, the memory of divine indifference, archives' clinical documentation of humanity as failed experiment, all of it. I talked for hours, days, recording everything while Rachel was at work, hiding the files on encrypted drives because the paranoid part of me worried that Site 53 was monitoring me, waiting for me to violate my NDA so they could disappear me. And in the recording, I tried to make sense of it, tried to find some way to live with what I knew, tried to answer the question that had been eating at me since that final session. If we're abandoned experiments, if meaning is just something we assign, if there's no cosmic purpose to any of this, then why keep going? Why not just give in to the nihilism and accept that it's all pointless? I didn't have a good answer. Still don't. But I keep recording because maybe the act of documenting, of preserving this information even if no one ever hears it, is its own kind of meaning. Archive came to document humanity, and then died before it could transmit its findings. Maybe this is my way of completing its mission. Maybe by telling this story, by preserving what the entity showed me, I'm creating the meaning that the universe didn't provide. Or maybe I'm just a broken man talking into a recorder, because it's the only way I can process trauma I can't share. I don't know anymore. What I do know is this. If you're hearing this recording, if I've somehow found the courage to let it out into the world, then you're carrying part of this weight now too. You know what I know. You've seen what I've seen. And I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for destroying whatever comfortable beliefs you had about God and prayer and humanity's place in the universe. But the entity was right about one thing. We survived abandonment. We're still here, still creating, still reaching for something beyond ourselves even though there's nothing out there reaching back. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that has to be enough, because it's all we have. Part 12. The envelope. 3 days ago. The photograph arrives, the empty cell. But there's writing on the wall in his handwriting that wasn't there when the entity died. They came back for it. Marcus doesn't remember writing it. Doesn't remember being in that cell after the entity died. But it's definitely his writing. What did they make him do during those evaluation sessions? What else did he see that they erased? And if the gardeners came back to retrieve their failed experiment's body, are they coming back for the witnesses too? He ends the recording. If you're hearing this, and it disappears tomorrow, you'll know why. 3 days ago, an envelope arrived in my mailbox. No return address, no postage, no postal markings at all. Just my name written in block letters on a plain manila envelope that someone had placed there directly, which meant someone knew where I lived. Someone had been to my house. I should have thrown it away immediately. Should have reported it to... who? The police? Site 53? But I didn't. I took it inside, waited until Rachel left for work, and opened it with hands that were already shaking because some part of me knew that whatever was inside was going to shatter the fragile piece I'd been trying to build. Inside was a single photograph, high resolution, printed on photo paper, a surveillance still from one of the cameras in the entity's containment cell. The timestamp said it was taken 4 days after the entity died. which put it at exactly the day they'd finished my final psychiatric evaluation and started my discharge paperwork. I stared at that timestamp for a full minute because it didn't make sense. 4 days after the entity died, I was in psychiatric review. I was in Dr. Patterson's office talking about my intrusive thoughts and difficulty readjusting. I wasn't in the containment cell. I definitely wasn't in the containment cell, but the photograph showed me there, standing in the center of that empty cell, my back to the camera, facing the wall where the entity used to sit. I was wearing the facility-issued clothes, the same ones I'd worn during my interrogation sessions. My posture was rigid, unnatural, like I was standing at attention but wrong somehow. And on the wall in front of me, written in what I immediately recognized as my own handwriting, were 4 words in large letters. They came back for it. I dropped the photograph, literally let it fall from my hands while my brain tried to process what I was seeing. That was my handwriting. I'd know it anywhere, the specific slant of my letters, the way I crossed my T's. But I had no memory of being in that cell after my final session with the entity. No memory of writing those words. No memory of even thinking those words. The last time I'd been in that containment area was when I walked away from Archive's dying body, and I'd never gone back. Or at least I thought I hadn't. What else explained the photograph? I picked it up again with shaking hands and examined every detail. The timestamp was clear. 4 days, post-entity death, 0247 hours. Early morning, when I should have been in my quarters trying and failing to sleep. But there I was, in that cell, writing on the wall. Why would I write that? They came back for it. The gardeners? Had the gardeners returned to retrieve Archive's body? The entity had said it was essentially a tool, a biological machine created to document their experiments. If it had failed its mission, died before transmitting its findings, would they come back to recover it, retrieve the data manually? And if I'd witnessed that, if I'd somehow been present when the gardeners returned, why couldn't I remember it? I thought about those evaluation sessions with Dr. Patterson and his team. The way they'd ask me the same questions over and over. The medications they'd given me, supposedly to help me sleep. The gaps in my memory around those final days at Site 53, stretches of time I'd attributed to exhaustion and trauma, but now seemed suspicious. Had they erased my memory? Was that even possible? I'd heard rumors in the military about experimental protocols for dealing with classified information exposure, chemical interventions, targeted memory suppression, ways to make people forget things they weren't supposed to know. I'd always dismissed them as conspiracy theory bullshit, but now I wasn't so sure. Because I had this photograph proving I'd been somewhere I couldn't remember being, doing something I couldn't remember doing, writing a message that I couldn't remember writing. They came back for it. Not, I think they came back, or did they come back? Definitive, certain, like I'd witnessed it directly, like I'd seen the gardeners return to collect their failed archive unit, and had written that message as evidence before they could erase what I'd seen. But if I'd been smart enough to write the message, why hadn't I been smart enough to preserve the actual memory? Or had I tried and failed? Was there some version of me that existed for a few hours 4 days after the entity died? A version that saw things beyond what I'd already learned, and then that version was chemically erased, leaving only this cryptic message scratched on a wall? I spent the next 6 hours going through my memory of those final days at Site 53, trying to find gaps, trying to identify where the missing time might be. There were spaces that felt wrong, periods where I remembered being in my quarters, but couldn't recall specific details. A medical examination that seemed to last much longer than necessary. Dr. Patterson asking me to count backwards from 100, and then I was in a different room with no memory of walking there. I'd attributed all of this to stress and trauma, my mind fragmenting under the weight of what I'd learned. But what if it was deliberate? What if they'd given me something, shown me something else, something beyond even what Archive had revealed, and then tried to erase it? The photograph suggested I'd been successful in leaving myself a message, but successful in leaving only that message, with no context, no explanation, just 4 words that raised more questions than they answered. They came back for it. I kept saying it out loud, trying to trigger some memory, some flash of recognition. Nothing. It was like reading words I'd written while blackout drunk. Technically my handwriting, but completely disconnected from my consciousness. I pulled out my laptop and started researching. Memory suppression techniques, chemical amnesia, classified military protocols for information control. Most of it was speculation and conspiracy theory, but there were enough credible sources to confirm that yes, it was technically possible to disrupt memory formation, to create targeted amnesia for specific events. Not perfect, not guaranteed, but possible. And if Site-53 had access to non-human biology, had been studying an entity that could communicate directly with human minds, who knew what other capabilities they'd developed? Maybe they'd learned something from Archive. Some technique for manipulating human consciousness. Some way to reach into someone's mind and delete what they didn't want them to remember. The paranoia started then, really started, in a way it hadn't before. Because if they could erase my memory once, they could do it again. Every gap in my memory since returning home, every moment of lost time, could be evidence of continued intervention. Maybe they'd been monitoring me all along. Maybe the medical discharge was just a cover to keep me accessible, while they determined how much I remembered and what needed to be suppressed. Maybe Rachel wasn't safe. Maybe just by living with me, by being married to someone who'd seen what I'd seen, she'd become a security risk too. I thought about that NDA I'd signed, the one that threatened my family if I disclosed anything. What if the threat wasn't just legal? What if they could make me forget her entirely if they needed to? Erase her from my memory like I'd never been married, never loved anyone, never had a reason to stay quiet. The thought made my blood run cold. I started checking the house for surveillance equipment, tore apart my bedroom looking for cameras or microphones, found nothing, which proved nothing. If Site-53 had access to technology beyond human understanding, their surveillance wouldn't be detectable by civilian bug sweepers. That night, Rachel asked me what was wrong, said I was acting paranoid and strange. I almost told her everything, almost showed her the photograph and explained what it meant, but I couldn't, because if I was under surveillance, if they were still monitoring me, telling Rachel would put her at risk. Better she think I was losing my mind than know the truth and become a target. So I lied again, told her I was fine, just stressed, still processing the classified assignment. She didn't believe me, I could see it in her eyes, but she didn't push, just looked at me with this sad expression that said she was watching me disappear into something she couldn't understand or help with. And she was right, I was disappearing. The person I'd been before Site-53 was gone, erased more thoroughly than any chemical intervention could achieve. And the person I was now was just fragments, pieces of memory and knowledge I couldn't fully access, writing messages to myself that I couldn't remember writing. I'm recording this now because I don't know how much time I have left. The photograph was a warning. Someone at Site-53, maybe Chen, maybe someone else who knew what happened to me, sent it as evidence that I'd seen more than I remembered, that I'd witnessed something after the entity died, that the gardeners had come back, and if the gardeners came back once, they might come back again. Not for Archive's body, they already retrieved that, but for the witnesses, for everyone who'd interacted with the entity, learned what it knew, carried information about the gardeners that was never supposed to reach human consciousness. Archive had contaminated the experiment by telling me the truth, and maybe the gardeners had come back to sterilize that contamination. Maybe that's what I saw, and what they made me forget. Maybe that's why I wrote "they came back for it" as a warning to my future self. Because it wasn't just Archive's body, it was the information, the knowledge, the contamination, and they came back to erase it, starting with the memories of everyone who'd been exposed. I don't know how much of my memory is real anymore. Don't know how much has been suppressed or altered or completely fabricated. This recording might be the only true account of what happened at Site-53, assuming I'm remembering it correctly, assuming even these memories haven't been compromised. I've been experiencing flashes lately. Brief images that don't connect to anything, that feel like memory but I can't place them in any timeline. A bright light that isn't light, not exactly. A presence in the cell with me and Archive's body, but not human, not physical. A sensation of being examined, categorized, measured. Words in my mind that aren't mine and aren't the entities. Something else entirely. Something vast and cold and calculating. Contamination contained. Documentation terminated. Observers to be remediated. I don't know if these are real memories surfacing, or if I'm just constructing narratives to fill the gaps, but they feel real. They feel like truth scratching its way back through whatever they used to bury it. If you're hearing this recording, I either found the courage to release it, or something happened to me, and someone found these files. Either way, you need to know what I learned at Site-53. You need to know that we're not alone in the universe, but we're not special either. We're failed experiments in a cosmic garden, abandoned by our creators because we disappointed them. Every prayer is wasted breath. Every religious experience is self-deception. Every moment of faith is conversation with an absence. We survived our abandonment, and maybe that matters. Maybe that's its own kind of success. But the gardeners don't see it that way. They see us as contaminated data, a failed experiment that needs to be terminated properly. And they came back. The photograph proves it. They came back for it. They came for Archive's body and its documentation. But I think they're coming back for more. For everyone who knows what Archive revealed. For every witness to be remediated, whatever that means. For the contamination to be fully contained. I don't know if I'll be here tomorrow. Don't know if I'll remember recording this by tonight. Don't know if they're already in my head right now, deciding what I get to keep and what needs to be erased. But I needed to get this out. Needed to document what happened because documentation is preservation, and preservation is the closest thing to meaning that we have left. Archive died trying to document us. Maybe I'll die trying to document what happened to Archive. There's a symmetry to that. A pointless, arbitrary symmetry in an indifferent universe, but symmetry nonetheless. If this recording disappears, if I disappear, if everyone who was at Site 53 starts experiencing memory problems or accidents or sudden medical issues, you'll know why. The gardeners came back. Not to save us or judge us or even destroy us out of malice, just to clean up a mess, to remediate the contamination, to erase the evidence that they were ever here. We're being deleted from their files, expunged from their records, like we never existed at all. And maybe that's worse than abandonment. At least abandoned children can tell stories about the parents who left. But erased children have no stories, no memory, no evidence they were ever anything at all. This is Staff Sergeant Marcus Holloway. If you're hearing this, I was at Site 53. I interrogated something from beyond our world. It told me truths that destroyed my faith and my sanity. And then the gardeners came back for it. Pause. The photograph is sitting on my desk right now. My handwriting on that wall. Message from a version of myself I don't remember being. They came back for it. I keep staring at it, trying to remember, trying to access whatever memory they buried. Nothing. Just fragments and flashes and the growing certainty that I'm running out of time. Pause. Rachel is calling me for dinner. I should go. Should pretend to be normal for a few more hours. Should let her believe I'm just struggling with PTSD from a classified assignment, not carrying knowledge that makes me a target for cosmic sterilization. Longer pause. If this is my last recording, if they come for me tonight or tomorrow or whenever they decide I'm too much of a risk, I want to say this. We survived abandonment. That has to count for something. Even if the gardeners don't think we matter, even if we're just failed experiments to be erased, we survived. We created meaning where there was none. We built civilizations in the darkness. We reached for the stars, even though no one was reaching back. And that's ours. That belongs to us. They can erase our memories, our records, our evidence, but they can't erase what we've already done, what we've already become. We're here. We're still here. And that has to matter. That has to fucking matter. Sound of recording device being turned off and on again. 3 days. That's how long ago the envelope arrived. If you're hearing this and it's been longer than 3 days since I recorded this, if weeks or months or years have passed, then either they didn't come for me, or I'm already gone and someone found these files. Either way, you know what I know now. You carry this weight. I'm sorry for that, but someone has to remember. Someone has to document that we were here, that we knew the truth, that we survived our abandonment, even if we couldn't survive what came after. Final pause. They came back for it, and I think they're coming back for us. If this recording disappears tomorrow, if I disappear tomorrow, you'll know why.